The series begins in 1989 in Colombia, and we learn that drug trafficking was extraordinarily widespread in the country at that time, with drugs being smuggled from Colombia to the United States. For this reason, the U.S. was providing support to the Colombian police to catch drug traffickers in order to eliminate this ongoing headache. At that time, wiretapping technology wasn't as advanced as it is today. The U.S. was only able to intercept wireless phones. They needed a plane to fly over the area near the wireless phone to capture the signals. However, there was another problem. While they could intercept these phones, they couldn't identify the speaker. So, the U.S. developed voice recognition technology to identify speakers. Now, we move to one of the U.S. security centers in Colombia, where they receive a signal from a drug dealer named Poison, and they discover that he is on his way to a certain restaurant to meet another drug dealer named Lizard. Immediately, an officer on the scene contacts Murphy, a DEA officer now in Colombia, to inform him of everything that is happening. Murphy instantly contacts a Colombian officer named Carrillo to inform him of the information. Carrillo and his team rush to the restaurant where Poison and Lizard are, and they open fire on everyone there, successfully completing the mission. But, let's rewind a bit to understand how Officer Murphy reached this point, working in Colombia and assisting the Colombian police in catching drug traffickers. In the 1970s, we moved to Chile, which was ruled by a dictator named Pinochet, heavily supported by the United States. The U.S. feared that if Pinochet were overthrown, the communists would take control of the country. For this reason, they supported Pinochet with all their might. At that time, Chile was a major center for drug dealers and the smuggling of drugs into the U.S. As a result, Pinochet launched a campaign against drug dealers and arrested them all, but he didn't stop there. He killed them and buried them in mass graves. On one occasion, soldiers had gathered a group of traffickers to kill them, but after the soldiers left, one of the traffickers survived because no bullets hit him. This trafficker was named Mateo Moreno, known by the nickname La Cucaracha because he liked that name. After surviving, he returned home, took his wife, and fled the country to Colombia, the new drug trafficking hub after Chile. La Cucaracha needed to collaborate with a new smuggler in Colombia to smuggle the drugs he produced to other countries. At the time, Colombia was home to 3 notorious smuggling gangs. The first was the Ochoa Brothers gang, 3 brothers, Jorge and Fabio, who smuggled everything from Colombia to anywhere in the world. However, their problem was that they were very expensive, which is why La Cucaracha decided not to deal with them. He was left with 2 options. The first gang was led by Jose Gacha, a madman who would kill anyone at any time without reason. So, La Cucaracha stayed away from him. The last gang was led by Pablo Escobar and his cousin Gustavo. At that time, Pablo and Gustavo were smuggling simple items like electrical devices and televisions. In one operation, they were stopped by the Colombian police, led by Herrera, who initially decided to detain them. However, Pablo told him that he knew him and his entire family, and that if he didn't let them continue their work, he would wipe them all out, one by one. At that moment, Herrera realized that Pablo was not someone to be trifled with, and instead of arresting him, he decided to cooperate with him in exchange for a bribe. That night, Pablo and Gustavo met with La Cucaracha, who told them that he made cocaine and wanted to smuggle it to Peru, where he could sell a gram for $10. But Pablo suggested a better idea, smuggling cocaine to Miami in the United States, where they could sell the gram for a much higher price. La Cucaracha was impressed with the idea, and they decided to start smuggling drugs to Miami instead of Peru. Moving to Miami, we see that Officer Murphy and his colleague Kevin work for the DEA there, where marijuana trafficking was very widespread. One day, they chase a suspect involved in marijuana trafficking and easily catch him. Afterwards, they go together to celebrate at a casino. During the celebration, Kevin tells Murphy that there's a girl at the place who is interested in him. The naive Murphy believes it, but it was just a prank by Kevin. Nonetheless, Murphy goes to the girl and asks for her number. She initially refuses, but after his persistence, she gives him a number. When Murphy returns home and calls the number, he finds out that it was indeed the girl's number. From that moment, Murphy falls in love with her and eventually marries her. On the other hand, we see that Pablo and Gustavo go to visit La Cucaracha in Peru. It becomes clear that La Cucaracha had set up a small lab in Peru to manufacture cocaine. Pablo began taking drugs from La Cucaracha and sending them to Colombia to be sold there and smuggled to America as well. After a while, Pablo noticed that the business was growing and expanding, and that he needed La Cucaracha by his side more frequently. So, he bought a house in Colombia and asked La Cucaracha to manufacture the cocaine there. Later, we see Pablo at home with his mother and his wife, Tata. We learn that they are fully aware of his activities, as Pablo's mother was making him a jacket with secret pockets to smuggle drugs. Gustavo arrives at the house with another man named Leon, and we learn that Leon will be placing the drugs in the jacket made by Pablo's mother to smuggle them to America. When Leon arrives in America, he meets another man named Letter, and we find out that Letter will be responsible for distributing the drugs in America. Over time, the business grew so much that Leon could no longer smuggle the drugs by himself, so he hired other people to help him. These people were diverse, including pilots, women, and others. After some time, the smuggling expanded, and Pablo had to hide the drugs in food shipments sent from Colombia to America, like potatoes and coffee. Once, Pablo and Gustavo went to meet with Letter, who told them that he had purchased a private plane capable of transporting more than 1,300 kilograms of cocaine in one trip to Miami. Of course, everyone was thrilled, and they decided to increase their activity. As the business grew, Pablo set up cocaine labs in remote areas in the jungle so that no one could reach them. On another occasion, Pablo and Gustavo visited the lab in the jungle and met with La Cucaracha there. La Cucaracha expressed his dissatisfaction to Pablo, feeling that Pablo no longer valued him in the business as he used to and that he was receiving far less money than he deserved, even though he was the one who introduced Pablo to this business in the first place. From that moment, Pablo began to feel uneasy about La Cucaracha and was convinced that one day he would come to claim what he thought was his. Some time passed, and we see Pablo sitting with Gotcha and a member of the Ochoa brothers gang. An agreement was made between Pablo and them that he would smuggle their cocaine to Miami, as they were having difficulty smuggling it themselves. In return, Pablo would take 35% of the value of each shipment. Everyone agreed to this deal, and as a result, cocaine spread in Miami to the extent that the police, led by Murphy, found themselves engaging in daily shootouts with drug traffickers there. On one occasion, Murphy killed a cocaine dealer who was no older than 17. Although Murphy killed him in self-defense, he felt deeply saddened by it. Back in Colombia, we see La Cucaracha going to meet Gustavo, asking him to arrange a meeting with Pablo to increase his share of the money. But Gustavo refuses and tells La Cucaracha to stay away from Pablo or else he will kill him. La Cucaracha reluctantly agrees but secretly decides to deceive both Gustavo and Pablo. Later, we see the police, led by Herrera, intercepting Pablo's men smuggling drugs and arresting them. Although Herrera had an agreement with Pablo, he still arrested them, and we will later find out why he did this. The next day, Pablo learns from Gustavo that Herrera had seized their cocaine shipments, which enrages Pablo. He goes to Herrera at the police station and, without any introduction, starts cursing him angrily. Herrera responds, and they decide to call in forensic photographers to document the moment of Pablo's arrest. Those photos taken of Pablo would cost him dearly in the future, as his features became known in criminal records. After that, Herrera summoned Pablo and told him that he didn't want any problems with him, but that Pablo had to increase the money he was paying him from $150,000 to $1 million per shipment, especially since each shipment was being sold for $5 million. Pablo considered the matter and asked Herrera to tell him who had leaked the price of the shipment to him, promising to increase the amount in exchange for knowing this person. Herrera told Pablo that it was La Cucaracha who had leaked this information to him and also informed him that La Cucaracha was smuggling drugs behind his back in Miami and selling them for his own benefit. This drove Pablo into a rage, and he decided to end La Cucaracha's life as soon as possible. But wait, who is La Cucaracha's drug dealer in Miami? We find out his identity when we see Murphy and Officer Kevin undercover, waiting for the cocaine dealer to buy drugs from him, but they were actually planning to arrest him. Shortly after, the dealer arrives, and his name is Herman. We learn that Herman is La Cucaracha's dealer in Miami. Everything was going smoothly, and Murphy and Kevin were about to arrest Herman, but something unexpected happened. Two men on a motorcycle stormed the scene and started shooting at everyone. Pablo had sent these gunmen to kill Herman because he found out he was working with La Cucaracha. Unfortunately, the gunmen managed to kill Kevin and Herman, while Murphy succeeded in killing one of them and arresting the other, whose name was La Kika. La Kika was sentenced, but he was released on bail worth $2 million, which was, of course, paid by Pablo. At this time, Murphy felt that his friend's justice had not been served, so he took his wife and moved to Colombia to pursue Pablo and work on capturing him. Yes, this is how Murphy ended up in Colombia and began working with Colombian officers. And this brings us to the incident at the beginning of the story when I mentioned that Murphy sent a Colombian officer named Carrillo to deal with Poison and Lizard, who were drug dealers. After this operation was completed, we see Murphy heading to the operation site and documenting everything to investigate later. Then we see Gustavo meeting with Pablo, and from their conversation, We learn that Poison and Lizard were indeed working with Pablo. Gustavo also informs Pablo that there is an American officer named Murphy investigating the case, and Pablo begins to feel a serious threat from Murphy. As a result, Gustavo orders a large bounty of $500,000 for anyone who kills Murphy. However, you should know that the case of Poison and Lizard happened a long time after Murphy settled in Colombia. So, let's go back a bit to see what Murphy did since arriving in Colombia. Going back, we see Murphy and his wife, Connie, on the plane heading to Colombia. At this time, Pablo's operations were booming like never before, to the extent that Letter, a major drug dealer working with Pablo, had bought a large island in the Bahamas and set up a gas station and an aircraft rest stop there. Meanwhile, Pablo and Gustavo had expanded their operations and set up many cocaine manufacturing labs. They also brought in scientists from Germany to improve the quality of the cocaine and conceal it better. The scientists hid the cocaine in unexpected places, such as Coca-Cola bottles and other hard-to-detect locations. In another scene, we see Pablo and Gotcha standing by a boat and discovering that the boat contains drugs. Gotcha brings his dog to sniff out the drugs, but the dog does not detect anything because the drugs were hidden between layers of glass in the boat, which astonishes Gotcha. Then Gustavo tells Pablo that the drug money has increased so much that they are unable to launder it. Pablo responds that he will handle it. Indeed, Pablo sets up a small taxi company to launder the money. However, the money was far too much to be laundered through one or two companies, so they decided to do something crazy, bury the money in secret locations known only to Pablo and Gustavo. But as they say, news cannot be hidden. Consequently, news of Pablo's wealth and drug dealers spread throughout Colombia. We now see a gang called M19, a communist armed group led by someone named Ivan the Terrible. This group was so reckless that they broke into a museum and stole a sword belonging to Simon Bolivar, the liberator of Colombia. The gang decided to kidnap Martha Ochoa, the sister of the Ochoa brothers we mentioned earlier. They indeed kidnapped her and demanded a large ransom from her brothers. On the same day Martha was kidnapped, Murphy and his wife Connie arrived in Colombia. Upon their arrival, an airport official decided to detain them for a while due to their American nationality. Later, a corrupt officer arrived and asked Murphy about his reason for being in Colombia. Murphy told him he would be working at the American embassy. After the officer checked Murphy's passport and realized he was an officer, he took the passport to verify it. This passport eventually reached the drug dealers, who became aware of all the American officers present in Colombia. At this time, Pablo appeared on TV in an interview with a host named Virginia Vallejo, talking about himself as a businessman and portraying himself as someone involved in charitable work. Through this, we get a glimpse that Pablo is trying to improve his image because he plans to enter politics. But beyond all this, my friend, remember Vallejo well, as she will get very close to Pablo and will play a significant role in the future. At the same time that events were unfolding in Colombia, there was an officer named Javier Peña working in American drug enforcement at the embassy. Javier was involved with a woman named Helena, and he planned to help her move to America if she provided him with important information. One day, Javier went to the embassy and met Murphy for the first time. From that moment, they became partners in fighting drug dealers, including Pablo and others. Later, they discovered that drug dealers would be gathering at a specific hotel, so they enlisted the help of Officer Carrillo and went to the hotel to photograph all the dealers, including Pablo. At the meeting in the hotel, Pablo revealed his plans to create a new criminal organization that he would run, protect, and secure. All attendees agreed to Pablo's plans, and from that point, Pablo became the leader of almost all drug dealers in Colombia. Pablo decided to name his organization Death to the Kidnappers and make its first operation against the M19 gang to retrieve Martha Ochoa. After the meeting, a small celebration was held at the hotel, and Helena found herself at the event. Gotcha became interested in Helena, and she tried to extract information from him. However, Gotcha sensed something was wrong and handed Helena over to his men for torture. At this time, Javier, Murphy, and Carrillo were waiting for Helena to obtain information from her but found no trace of her. Javier decided to rescue her himself, and he, along with Carrillo and several soldiers, went to the hotel, where they eliminated Gotcha's men and freed Helena. Meanwhile, Pablo began executing his plans against the M19 gang, sending his men to kill the gang members without negotiation. On one occasion, Ivan went to the gang's headquarters and found all his men dead, with a message threatening that they must return Martha Ochoa or everyone and their families would die. Ivan was frightened by the threat and returned Martha Ochoa to Pablo, then came himself to Pablo with the legendary Simon Bolivar sword. Ivan asked Pablo to kill him, but he expressed concern for his family. However, Pablo accepted the sword as a gift only and did not harm him or his family. In return, Pablo decided to employ Ivan in his operations. Over time, Pablo's reputation and his organization death to the kidnappers grew significantly. One day, Murphy returned home with his wife, Connie, to find their home destroyed and open, and their cat had been killed. Murphy realized after meeting Javier that the drug dealers had discovered his identity through information leaked by airport workers. Murphy and Javier went to the American embassy in Colombia to report what had happened and asked the ambassador for assistance in the investigation. The ambassador informed them of a corrupt officer named Suarez who might help them. Javier and Murphy used money to obtain information from Suarez about who had entered Murphy's home. After interrogating the airport workers, it turned out that the information had been leaked to Poison, who was behind the attack on Murphy's home. So, the two decided to pursue Poison. Meanwhile, Vallejo, the journalist, grew closer to Pablo, and Pablo aimed to enter politics to support the poor, as he had once been poor himself. Vallejo used her connections to arrange a meeting for Pablo with lawyer Duque, who represented the ruling Liberal Party in Colombia. An agreement was reached between Pablo and Duque, where Duque would take $300,000 for himself, and in return, Pablo would be introduced to the Minister of Justice to support him in the elections, with an additional donation of $3 million from Pablo to the Ministry of Justice. Initially, Lara, the Minister of Justice, refused to accept the donation because he was an honest minister. However, he was eventually convinced after Duque persuaded him that they would benefit from the funds for the Ministry of Justice. In a later phase, we see Pablo talking with Poison and some of his gang members, instructing them to go meet the Minister of Justice and deliver $3 million as agreed. They agree to the task, but on the other side, Carrillo, Murphy, and Javier are monitoring Poison's phone to determine his destination. They decide to set up an ambush to catch him, but a small issue arises. Suarez, a corrupt individual working for Pablo, contacts Pablo and demands money in exchange for important information. Pablo learns from Suarez that the police have set up an ambush for Poison and that he is in danger. Consequently, Pablo quickly calls Poison and orders him to return immediately with the money. Poison complies and returns, preventing the police from capturing him. Subsequently, Pablo continues organizing conferences to boost his standing before the elections, and he does not forget to distribute money to the poor to increase his popularity. During one of the conferences, his wife Tata is also present, as is Vallejo. Tata notices the interest between Pablo and Vallejo, and when she returns home, she asks Pablo to completely avoid Vallejo. Pablo denies any infidelity and reassures her. Tata's health deteriorates due to the approaching delivery date, and Pablo takes her to the hospital. Meanwhile, his cousin Gustavo arrives and urges him to leave politics altogether. Pablo disregards this advice, and Tata gives birth to a daughter, which makes him extremely happy. At the same time, Gacha speaks with the Ochoa brothers, expressing their dissatisfaction with Pablo's decision to leave the work to them as Pablo aimed to reach the Senate to increase his influence. They seem to be contemplating rebellion against Pablo but fear taking action. That night, Pablo meets with Letter and decides to appoint him to manage the cocaine laboratories instead of his cousin Gustavo, as Pablo felt disgruntled with Gustavo because of what he said in the hospital. Pablo asks Letter about the dissatisfaction of Gacha and the Ochoa brothers regarding the elections, and Letter informs him that they are indeed upset as they see no benefit in his candidacy. From the next day, Letter starts managing the cocaine laboratories, and production significantly increases. At the American embassy, the ambassador meets with Murphy and Javier and they discover that Pablo might enter the Senate, which cannot be allowed. They need to prove that Pablo is a criminal and deals in drugs. They decide to search through Pablo's old files and discover that Suarez had information about Pablo's past arrest for smuggling. They also find contacts of officers who can provide details about the old case. However, Suarez was corrupt and was selling information to both Murphy, Javier, and Pablo, who was sending his men to kill anyone who could prove anything against him. After all their avenues were blocked, they decide to target the photographer who took pictures of Pablo in the old case. They manage to locate the photographer, retrieve the photos from him, and place him under witness protection to ensure his safety. Murphy, the ambassador, and Javier meet with Minister Lara and present the photos proving Pablo's involvement in drug trafficking. Lara, who considers himself honest, decides to expose Pablo and begins a campaign against drug dealers. After a while, elections begin in Colombia and Pablo loses the election. However, Pablo does not give up as he managed to get one of the winners to resign his Senate seat, thus officially becoming a member of the Senate. Some time later, the first Senate session begins, and Pablo enters, extremely happy as he had dreamed of this moment for a long time. However, Pablo's joy fades when Lara, during the session, declares that Pablo is a drug dealer unfit to be a senator. He proves his claim by showing the photo of Pablo from the smuggling case. Pablo, enraged, leaves the place and then starts a media war against Lara. Lara successfully exposes Gacha as a drug dealer who owns a football team, forcing him to leave the club. He also exposes the Ochoa brothers, leading to the Colombian government sending Lara to Czechoslovakia as an ambassador for his protection against assassination. On the other hand, we see Pablo sitting with Gustavo and his wife, deeply upset about what happened, and he decides to take revenge on Lara before he travels. On the day Lara was scheduled to travel, Pablo appears on television and announces his resignation from the Senate and retirement from politics. However, this announcement is not genuine. Pablo has arranged for Lara's assassination. When Lara heads to the airport, he is shot by Pablo's men and is killed in a very tragic scene. After Lara's death, Murphy and Javier feel anxious as they consider themselves responsible for what happened, especially since Lara was an honorable man. From that moment on, Murphy decides he will not work with any more honorable individuals in this dirty war. Despite the sadness left by Lara's death, there are positive aspects. One of the people involved in the killing was captured and confessed that Pablo Escobar ordered the murder. Based on this confession, Pablo became a wanted criminal. Additionally, Colombia and the United States reached an agreement stating that if Colombia captures anyone accused of drug trafficking, they can be extradited to the United States for trial, which caused panic among drug dealers and traffickers. Meanwhile, Pablo meets with Gacha, Gustavo, Letter, and the Ochoa brothers, and they decide to work hard against the issue of extradition to the US. They take all possible measures to protect themselves. Gacha hires a group of mercenaries for protection, Letter turns to the media to speak out against the extradition campaign, and the Ochoa brothers collaborate with a public relations firm to organize a massive campaign against the extradition of criminals to America. At the same time, Pablo employs a different method. He sends letters to prominent politicians warning them against supporting the extradition campaign and threatens to kill them and their families if they do. Pablo also sends letters to judges warning them against ruling on any criminal for extradition to America, forcing judges to wear masks during trials to protect their identities. Nevertheless, Pablo manages to discover their identities and kills them. In a meeting with a representative of the U.S. military and a U.S. intelligence representative in Colombia, the U.S. president announces a reduction in support for the Drug Enforcement Administration, deciding to allocate support to the military and intelligence to combat communism, which is considered the real threat to America. Consequently, the DEA's support is reduced to only $100,000 annually. Based on this, Javier and Murphy use this amount effectively. Javier bribes General Jaramillo of the Colombian police with $100,000, requesting him to assign Carrillo to Pablo's case, which Jaramillo agrees to. Carrillo begins his work quickly, taking Murphy and Javier to one of Pablo's men who had been previously captured. Carrillo tortures this man until he confesses Pablo's location. Based on the information they obtain, they raid Pablo's house, but find it empty as Pablo and Gustavo have managed to escape. They find an unburned piece of paper at the scene of the fire, which contains an address. When they go to this address, they discover it is Pablo's accountant's address. The accountant is arrested, and more than 6,000 papers and files incriminating Pablo are found. The evidence is sent to the Supreme Court of Colombia, but Jaramillo refuses to accept any evidence from Murphy or Javier, claiming that it belongs to the state due to his anger over the small bribe he received. Murphy steals a document from the evidence and discovers it contains a money transfer to someone named Cecil. They go to Suarez to find out who Cecil is, and he tells them that Cecil is a former American pilot who works illegally with Pablo, smuggling drugs for him. Murphy then goes to the U.S. intelligence representative and asks about Cecil. He confirms Cecil's address, and Cecil is subsequently captured. He agrees to cooperate with them in exchange for a pardon. They agree, and Cecil provides them with a photo showing Pablo in Nicaragua, with members of the Communist Council there who are involved in drug trafficking. This photo is a strong piece of evidence against Pablo and represents a significant breakthrough in the case. Murphy takes the photo and presents it to the U.S. ambassador, who in turn sends it to Washington. The issue spreads widely, and because the U.S. president had a negative stance towards communists, he decides to launch a broad war against communists and drug traffickers as their allies. As a result, Murphy and Javier receive unprecedented support in terms of weapons, money, and other resources, enabling them to reach and destroy many of Pablo Escobar's laboratories. In one of these labs, Letter is captured and extradited to the U.S., where he is sentenced to 135 years in prison. After these events, Pablo meets with Gacha, Gustavo, and the Ochoa brothers to inform them that the war has begun and he will not back down. Meanwhile, Javier and Murphy are in a restaurant when Connie, Murphy's wife, arrives with her friend Elisa, who works in a hospital. Elisa, who is secretly a member of the M19 communist group, recognizes everyone in the restaurant. On the same day, Pablo meets with Yvonne, the leader of the M19 group, and offers them a large sum of money to carry out a mission. The group agrees. After Pablo leaves, Elisa speaks with Yvonne and asks him about Pablo's visit. Yvonne reveals that Pablo was seeking their support for a major operation against the state. Elisa believes this is a mistake, so she goes to Connie the next day, confesses that she is a member of M19, and asks her to take her to any officer at the US Embassy to reveal important information. Connie agrees and takes Elisa to Javier, who learns all the information she obtained from Yvonne and contacts Murphy. They discover that Yvonne and his group are planning a catastrophic operation and rush to contact the ambassador. However, the news leaks, and it is discovered that the M19 group has taken over the Colombian Supreme Court and killed many judges and officers. Their goal was to burn 6,000 documents proving Pablo's involvement in drug trafficking. Indeed, they succeeded, and now there is no evidence to prove Pablo's involvement in anything. Subsequently, Murphy and Javier meet with the ambassador, military, and intelligence representatives, and try to convince them that the operation was staged to protect Pablo. However, they decide to stop pursuing Pablo and focus solely on the communists. Murphy and Javier decide not to mention Elisa as the source of the information to keep her safe. On the other hand, Pablo meets with Yvonne and his group to pay them, but he actually intends to eliminate them to prevent them from confessing their agreement with him. And indeed, they are eliminated. After a while, presidential candidate Galan appears in his speech and announces that he will fight drug traffickers, leading Caesar, Galan's assistant, to believe that Galan will face problems with drug traffickers. Meanwhile, Javier falls in love with Elisa and decides to smuggle her out of Colombia to protect her from drug traffickers and U.S. security forces that also seek to kill her because she is a communist. The next day, Javier meets with Murphy, and they decide to get Elisa out by any means necessary. Subsequently, Javier and Murphy meet with the ambassador, military, and intelligence representatives. They were asked to hand over the communist who provides them with information, but they refuse, which displeases the military and intelligence representatives. Later, Murphy and Javier inform them that Pablo and the drug traffickers are hiding in Panama under the protection of the Panamanian president. However, everyone refuses to believe this as the Panamanian president is an ally of the US president. It turns out that Pablo and his group are indeed there. They were considering returning to Colombia, but everyone was convinced that their presence in Panama was currently the best solution. In Panama, Pablo is with his wife at a restaurant, where he tells her he wants to return to Colombia, even if it means starting a war. He decides to launch a campaign to take revenge on Galan and then control the next presidential candidate to refuse to extradite drug traffickers to the U.S., which would make it easier for him to return to Colombia. On the same day, Galan is assassinated during a conference. The following day, at the morning ceremony, where Caesar, Galan's family, and others attended, Galan's son asks Caesar to run for president. Caesar decides to run for the presidency. As soon as Caesar begins his presidential campaign, we see Pablo, Gacha, and the Ochoa brothers board a plane returning to Colombia. After returning, Pablo sits with Duque and Vallejo and asks them to go to Caesar and convince him to cooperate with Pablo and the traffickers instead of the US. Duque and Vallejo do indeed meet with Caesar and ask him to refuse extraditing anyone to the U.S., assuring him that this is the only way to avoid being assassinated like Galan. Caesar becomes furious at this threat, kicks them out, and contemplates what to do about Pablo. While Caesar is making his decision, we cut to Javier, who is sitting in his office when an American military officer arrives and informs him that they have captured a member of the M19 group and will force him to confess that Elisa is helping Murphy and Javier, which would lead to her, Javier, and Murphy being prosecuted. Javier goes to an embassy official and asks her to prepare fake documents for Elisa so he can smuggle her out of the country. Meanwhile, the American military officer is seen torturing a member of the M19 group until he confesses that Elisa is indeed collaborating with Javier and Murphy, and that they are hiding her. The officer is thrilled with this confession and plans to arrest her. Elsewhere, we see Carrillo still continuing his work, constantly monitoring Pablo's phone in an attempt to catch him. On one occasion, Carrillo is sitting in a restaurant with his wife when one of Pablo's men bursts in and opens fire, intending to kill him. However, Carrillo manages to kill the attacker. Afterward, Carrillo calls Pablo and tells him that he's monitoring his house and knows his family, just as Pablo knows Carrillo's family. He threatens Pablo, saying that if Pablo involves his family in their conflict again, Carrillo will take out Pablo's family. Pablo hangs up, seething with rage, and decides to start a war against the police and the entire country. Pablo then sits with Gotcha, who tells him that he also plans to start a major war to prove the power of the drug traffickers. Gotcha intends to purchase very powerful missiles to fight the police and army. A man named Hartunga, Gotcha's assistant, joins them. After learning about the plan, Hartunga goes to meet Murphy and Javier and informs them that Gotcha will be in a certain city to buy the missiles. He offers them the chance to arrest Gotcha in exchange for protection and a reward. Murphy and Javier agree to consider it. The two then meet with the ambassador and brief her on everything that has happened. The ambassador asks Javier to go after Gotcha and try to capture him, while asking Murphy to stay behind to protect Caesar, who will appear at an upcoming conference. Before Javier leaves the city, Murphy hands him the forged documents for Elisa so he can smuggle her out. Meanwhile, Gotcha goes to the city to buy the missiles and successfully purchases one, but it's still unclear how Javier plans to capture him. Next, we cut to the conference where Caesar is speaking. At the start of the conference, Caesar had decided to refuse to extradite drug traffickers to the US. However, feeling guilty, he suddenly announces in front of everyone that if he becomes president, he will cooperate with the US and extradite all drug traffickers. This declaration sparks a major war between the government, drug traffickers, and Pablo. The war begins a few days later, as we see poison pass through a police checkpoint and, without warning, kills all the officers there, two, to be precise. Poison calls Pablo, who is sitting with his son, and informs him that he has killed 2 police officers. Pablo rejoices and instructs Poison to spread the word among his men that anyone who kills a police officer will receive a large monetary reward. From that moment, a massacre against police officers begins, claiming the lives of more than 200 officers in the city. We now turn to Murphy, who is inspecting his car as he plans to smuggle Elisa and is worried that the military officer may be spying on him. Indeed, he finds a bug in his car. He decides to use the bug to deceive the military officer. Shortly after, we see the military officer listening to a conversation between Murphy, his wife, and Elisa, and he believes that Murphy is planning to smuggle Elisa. The officer goes to confront Murphy and stops him, but he doesn't find Elisa or anyone else with him. In the end, it's revealed that Elisa had been with Connie, Murphy's wife, the whole time and had been safely smuggled out of the country. After Murphy finished dealing with Elisa's case, he decided to resume his search for Pablo. He went to Caesar and met with him, his assistant, and his chief bodyguard, Eduardo. Murphy informed them that he was on their side, and that if they needed anything to help protect them from Pablo, they could let him know. They thanked him and told him they would stay in touch. Later, Murphy met with one of his men, who gave him a picture of a Spanish man and told him that this Spaniard had arrived in Colombia and was received by Poison himself, which meant that this Spaniard was particularly important to Pablo. Murphy decided to follow this Spaniard and learn about his connection to Pablo. Meanwhile, the Spaniard was with Pablo and Gustavo, and from their conversation, we learn that the Spaniard is a bomb maker. Pablo asked him to make a bomb in exchange for 3,000 kilograms of cocaine. However, the Spaniard refused, which angered Gustavo, who was about to kick him out. But Pablo wasn't satisfied with that and continued to persuade him until the Spaniard finally agreed to make the bomb in exchange for 5,000 kilograms of cocaine. Gustavo, however, started feeling that Pablo was tarnishing his reputation more and more in front of everyone. The biggest proof of this was when he went to Martha Ochoa, where we discover that Gustavo secretly loves Martha, and no one knows about their relationship. Gustavo spoke to Martha, upset with Pablo for damaging his image. Martha suggested they run away together, but Gustavo refused. Meanwhile, Murphy decided to investigate the Spaniard, so he went to Suarez and asked him about his identity. But Suarez refused to disclose any information to Murphy, telling him that he only dealt with Javier. Murphy got angry and hit him, forcing Suarez to give him information about the Spaniard. After that, Murphy went to the embassy and met with the ambassador, the military representative, and the intelligence representative. He told them that he had discovered that the Spaniard was a bomb maker, and he believed Pablo had brought him to make a bomb to assassinate Caesar. Murphy asked them to search the intelligence files for any information about the Spaniard that might help in the case, and they agreed. Indeed, Murphy went into the intelligence archive and began searching until he discovered many details about the Spaniard, confirming that Pablo had brought him to make a large bomb targeting Caesar. Murphy and the ambassador then went to meet Caesar and his assistant Eduardo. They suggested that Caesar postpone any trips until the Spaniard was captured. But Caesar refused this idea and insisted on continuing his travels because he wanted to tour the country and speak to people about his campaign, not allowing anything to stop him. Murphy and the ambassador left the meeting, frustrated. At the same time, the Spaniard had finished making the bomb, placing it inside a recording device. Pablo then sent his men to a young man named Jamie, a newcomer working with Pablo. Pablo told him that he wanted him to travel on the same plane as Caesar and take the recording device with him to record conversations. Jamie agreed to the task, unaware that the device contained a bomb and not just a recorder, and that he would die along with Caesar. Meanwhile, Suarez, as usual, contacted Pablo and informed him that Murphy was searching for him and the Spaniard. Pablo became furious and sent poison to kill Suarez, as he did not want to work with someone who was also cooperating with U.S. drug enforcement. Days passed, and at the airport, Suarez was preparing to travel, as was Jamie, who believed he was carrying a recording device to document conversations. Before the plane took off, Murphy arrived and pleaded with Caesar not to travel, warning him that he would be assassinated. This time, Caesar got scared and decided not to travel. Jamie, however, boarded the plane and used the recording device as Pablo had instructed him, triggering the explosion and killing Jamie and everyone on board. Caesar, of course, remained unharmed as he hadn't boarded the plane. Elsewhere, we see Carrillo and Javier, who finally managed to locate Gotcha. They went to the site and confronted Gotcha and his men. Gotcha took the opportunity to grab his son Freddy and attempt to flee, while his men exchanged gunfire with Carrillo, Javier, and the police. Gotcha took a car and managed to escape, but Carrillo and his team chased him until they eventually killed both him and his son. This marked the first major successful hit by Carrillo and his team against the drug traffickers, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. After some time passed, we learned that the plane explosion had killed more than 107 people. As a result of this bombing, Pablo literally transformed into a globally wanted terrorist, becoming the #1 target in the United States. We now see Javier, Murphy, and Carrillo visiting Natalia, the wife of Jamie, the unfortunate young man who died in the plane explosion. They begin by asking Natalia if Pablo forced Jamie to board the plane or if someone else was involved. They warn her that it's in her best interest to cooperate with them so they can catch Pablo, as he will kill her and her young daughter to cover his crime. However, Natalia refuses to talk, fearing for her life. On the other side, we see Pablo bidding farewell to his entire family as he decides to escape to a safe place until things calm down. He then speaks to Poison and orders him to kill Natalia so that no one can link the plane incident back to him. Poison agrees, and we wait to see what he will do. We then move on to Caesar, who has won the election, and a celebratory event is held in his honor. During the event, Caesar sits with a man named Tobar, the former president of Colombia. Caesar asks Tobar for advice, and Tobar tells him not to trust the Americans because they could destroy him. Caesar agrees with his advice and acts on it. The next day, Caesar summons the U.S. ambassador, Murphy, Javier, and representatives from the military and intelligence agencies. He informs them that he will continue pursuing Pablo and won't stop. However, he asks them to stop their nationwide search for Pablo, as that is not their jurisdiction. After this meeting, we see the army and police continuing to attack Pablo's locations, hoping to capture him. But, due to the many informants Pablo has recruited, he escapes easily every time. Pablo doesn't remain silent about this and begins bombing various vital locations across the country in response to Caesar's actions. As the pressure on him increases, Pablo decides to meet with a gang leader named Pacho Herrera and asks him to collaborate in drug trafficking. However, Pacho refuses for several reasons, the most important being that he is arrogant and dislikes Pablo. Pablo is not pleased with his refusal, so he threatens to kill him and leaves. Afterward, Pacho decides to cause trouble for Pablo. In another scene, we see Pacho meeting the Ochoa family and revealing to them that their sister is having an affair with Gustavo, Pablo's cousin, and that they are secretly meeting regularly. Of course, the family is shocked by this news, and we don't yet know how they will react to their sister. Away from Pacho, we see Pablo sending Duque to meet Caesar to propose a deal. Pablo would stop the bombings in exchange for Caesar halting the pursuit of his men and raiding his warehouses. However, Caesar rejects this deal, and Duque returns to Pablo to inform him of what happened. Pablo becomes furious and asks Gustavo for advice. Gustavo tells him that the only solution is to kidnap important figures in the country to pressure Caesar into agreeing to negotiations. Pablo agrees and begins having his men kidnap the families of politicians and celebrities. We see that journalist Vallejo is always the first to cover these events, as she knows about them in advance from Pablo. In one instance, while Vallejo is covering a kidnapping, she meets a famous TV presenter, the daughter of former President Tobar. The presenter indirectly accuses Vallejo of having some connection to Pablo, which upsets Vallejo. She then goes to Pablo and asks him to kidnap Tobar's daughter, explaining that this would benefit him because she is a very famous figure. Pablo agrees and sends his men to kidnap her and imprison her in an unknown location. Later, Pablo brings Tobar's daughter and asks her to record a video confirming that she is fine, intending to pressure President Caesar into negotiating with him. Tobar's daughter is forced to comply, and the video is recorded and broadcast everywhere. Caesar, Tobar, and his wife watch the video together, and Tobar demands that Caesar negotiate with Pablo to release his daughter. Tobar threatens to cut off the financial support he provides and to tarnish Caesar's reputation in the media if he doesn't comply. Caesar is troubled by the situation and thinks carefully. In the end, he decides to negotiate with Pablo. We now see Pablo taking Gustavo to a location in the mountains, where he tells him that he intends to build a fortified castle in this beautiful place, which will serve as a safe haven to protect him from the police and any other threats. Pablo informs Gustavo that he will make this castle part of the deal with Caesar. Gustavo is thrilled and wholeheartedly agrees with the plan. On the other side, we see Poison and two killers searching for Natalia, Jamie's wife, to kill her. They arrive at her home, but they don't find her, as she had taken her young daughter and hidden at a friend's house. However, at one point, Poison and the killers manage to find Natalia and kill both her and her friend. The crazed Poison tries to kill Natalia's young daughter too, but he fails as Murphy and Javier arrive just in time. Poison and his companions escape, and Murphy and Javier try to chase them, but unfortunately, they are unable to catch them. Murphy returns to the house where Natalia had been and takes her daughter, deciding with his wife Connie to raise the child together. A week later, we see Pablo and Gustavo fleeing through the forest on their way to meet President Caesar when the police ambush them and open fire, forcing them to flee quickly. Pablo realizes that Caesar is trying to capture them before any agreement can be made, and he decides to take revenge and make Caesar regret this action. Pablo goes to Tobar's daughter and asks her to record another video demanding that Caesar agree to the negotiations, or else she and all the other hostages will be killed. Tobar's daughter agrees and records the video, which is broadcast widely, but Caesar remains unfazed and continues his attempts to capture Pablo. One day, U.S. intelligence manages to intercept a signal from the location where Tobar's daughter is being held. Carrillo and his team are sent to rescue her, but by mistake, they end up killing her instead of saving her. A funeral is held for Tobar's daughter, during which her mother speaks to Caesar and asks him to agree to Pablo's terms because all the other hostages will face the same fate if he doesn't. Caesar is finally moved by this and decides to accept Pablo's conditions. Later, Eduardo informs Murphy, Javier, and the ambassador that the president has decided to accept Pablo's terms, and he also tells them that the terms include Pablo admitting to being a drug dealer, but he will receive a very light sentence. Most importantly, Pablo will serve his prison sentence in his private castle, which he is building in the mountains, and the guards at the castle will be his own men, while the police will stay completely away from him. Everyone acknowledges that Pablo has imposed his will on the president, but Eduardo explains that this is the only solution to end the chaos that Pablo has caused, which they have been unable to control. Eduardo then leaves. On the other side, we see Pablo meeting with Duque, Vallejo, and Gustavo, and they celebrate the good news together. After the celebration, Pablo talks to Duque and tells him that this is not the end of the work, and his mission now is to try to reduce the prison time that Pablo will serve in his private prison. Afterward, Vallejo talks to Pablo and tells him that she will distance herself from him for the time being after his official admission as a drug dealer, as being close to him will damage her reputation as a journalist. Pablo responds by telling her that she must stay close to him whether she likes it or not. Pablo then talks to Gustavo and tells him that he knows about his relationship with Martha, the sister of the Ochoa brothers, and asks him to stay away from her to avoid causing any problems with the Ochoa brothers. Gustavo tells him that he will think about it. In the end, Pablo and Gustavo summon two of their men, Fernando and Kiko, and tell them that their mission will be to manage the business while Pablo and Gustavo are imprisoned in their castle. Pablo reassures them that they will be in constant contact with them, so they won't truly be imprisoned. Fernando and Kiko agree and thank Pablo for his great trust. On the other side, we see Carrillo meeting with Javier and Murphy, telling them that they must capture Pablo and Gustavo before the deal with Caesar is finalized. If the deal goes through, they will never be able to catch them. Murphy and Javier agree with him and decide to act on this matter immediately. At the same time, we see Pacho sitting with Vallejo, trying to convince her to turn against Pablo and work with him, but she doesn't give him a final response. During the conversation, Pacho hints to Vallejo that he is planning to get rid of Pablo soon, though he doesn't reveal how or when this will happen. As we know, Pacho doesn't speak in vain, and proof of this is that on the same night, Pablo is with his wife Tata at home when suddenly a bomb explodes in the house. Fortunately, neither Pablo nor Tata is harmed. Pablo quickly rushes to check on his son and finds him safe, but he finds his young daughter injured in her ear, which will cause her to lose hearing in one ear for life. Pablo loses his mind and tries to figure out who did this and who betrayed his location and leaked the information. The next day, the Ochoa brothers receive a picture showing Gustavo with their sister Martha, confirming that there is an illicit relationship between Gustavo and their sister, which angers them greatly. They go to Pacho and ask him to intervene and find a solution, suggesting that they confess their crimes to receive a lighter sentence, similar to Pablo. In return, they will hand Gustavo over to the police before the deal with President Caesar is completed. Pacho is thrilled by this proposal and agrees to help them. Not long after, we see the Ochoa brothers going to the police and confessing everything they know about Gustavo, including where he might be. Later, we see Gustavo in a hotel with Martha when suddenly Carrillo and a group of officers raid the place and arrest him. They take him to a remote location, where Carrillo talks to Gustavo and tells him that his kidnapping is illegal, and that the president has banned them from approaching either him or Pablo. Carrillo tells Gustavo that he could easily kill him if he doesn't tell them where Pablo is. But despite the threats, Gustavo refuses to reveal Pablo's location. Carrillo gets angry and orders the officers to beat Gustavo severely until he dies in a shocking scene. The news reaches Pablo and his family, and they are deeply saddened by Gustavo's murder. Pablo decides to take revenge and start a war against everyone. A few days later, Vallejo comes to Pablo and tells him that the Ochoa brothers betrayed Gustavo and that Pacho helped them. Pablo loses his mind and orders his men to kill Pacho. At that time, Pacho is playing a soccer match with his friends when suddenly Pablo's men storm the field and open fire on everyone. Pacho quickly escapes, and luckily he manages to get away without being killed. The next day, the news broadcasts that the Colombian House of Representatives has decided not to extradite drug traffickers to the United States, which was a decision that Pablo had been aiming for from the beginning. Pablo feels victorious and holds a funeral for Gustavo on the same day. A short time later, a plane arrives for Pablo, and Eduardo steps out, carrying with him the papers of the deal that was made with Caesar. Pablo signs the papers and surrenders himself, going with Eduardo to be detained in the prison that he built himself. On the same day that Pablo is imprisoned, Murphy receives news of poison being in a certain restaurant, accompanied by a large number of Pablo's killers and men. Murphy immediately sends Carrillo and his men to the restaurant, and they manage to kill everyone. As for Pablo, he settles into his fake prison where he lives a luxurious life. A truck would come to him daily, loaded with everything he desires, and the driver of the truck is named Basha, a name to remember later. Aside from the truck and its driver, we see one of Pablo's men, named Velasco, arriving and informing him that Pacho and his gang want to reconcile with him. Pablo agrees to the reconciliation but insists that first, he must kill some of Pacho's new men to teach him a lesson. Velasco agrees and relays the message to his men. Later, we see Pacho angry and saddened by the loss of his men, but he meets with Fernando and Kiko, who are running Pablo's business. Pacho tells them he is willing to pay $10 million to end the war. Fernando and Kiko relay the offer to Pablo, but the amount does not please him. Pablo instructs them to tell Pacho that he must pay $30 million, in addition to Fernando and Kiko having to pay $1 million a month instead of $250,000, along with other business profits. Fernando and Kiko are forced to accept the deal out of fear of Pablo's retaliation. On the other side, Javier and Murphy are sitting with Carrillo, who informs them that he will be transferred to Spain for a new assignment. Before his transfer, Carrillo gives Javier and Murphy a photo of Pablo's prison, which reveals that the prison is nothing but a facade. Carrillo asks them to continue tracking Pablo to prove that he is violating the prison agreement he made with Caesar, so they can demonstrate that the prison is not real. Javier and Murphy agree to this directive and decide to follow up on it. Later, Javier and Murphy meet with representatives from the military and intelligence to examine the photos of Pablo's prison. They discover that the prison has a bird tower, and they realize that Pablo uses this tower to send messages to his men outside the prison via birds. The next day, Javier and Murphy observe the prison and indeed see birds leaving the prison, carrying messages requesting money to be sent via the truck driven by Basha through the tunnel. Javier and Murphy start thinking about what the tunnel might refer to, and they discover that it refers to the truck and Basha transporting contraband into the prison. They capture the driver and decide to install cameras and microphones in the truck to document everything happening in it, to prove that Pablo is violating the prison agreement. Every day, Basha enters the prison with the truck and takes pictures of the truck's cargo, which includes alcohol, girls, or contraband items. These photos reach Caesar, and his assistant Eduardo tells him that it's time to transfer Pablo to a real prison. However, Caesar refuses and decides to ignore the matter, believing that moving Pablo might increase his terrorist activities. At the same time, Pablo is celebrating his birthday in his simple prison, where his family and friends come to visit, including Kiko's wife. She informs Pablo that Kiko is unhappy with the increase in the money he receives to $1 million, which makes Pablo suspicious of Kiko and uncomfortable with him. His suspicions are reinforced when Velasco discovers that a large sum of money, amounting to $3 million, was found on land owned by Kiko and Fernando. Velasco suspects that the money was stolen by Fernando and Kiko and buried on the land, reinforcing Pablo's belief that Kiko and Fernando have betrayed him. In reality, the money found on the land belonged to Pablo's accountant, who had been imprisoned earlier and intended to use it upon his release. The accountant had not told anyone about the money's location, but finding it on land owned by Fernando and Kiko strengthens the suspicion that they stole it. Pablo calls Fernando and Kiko to the prison and begins interrogating them about the money. Fernando and Kiko insist that they did not take any money and do not know how it ended up on the land. They confirm that the land originally belonged to Gustavo and that he might have buried the money and then forgotten about it. But Pablo does not believe this and accuses Kiko of being unhappy with the increase in the money, punishing Fernando by beating him severely until he dies, and then sends his men to kill Kiko. Fernando and Kiko's bodies are burned, and they die unjustly despite having committed no crime. On the other side, Gotcha's assistant goes to meet Pacho. Pacho informs Gotcha's assistant that Kiko and Fernando have been killed inside the prison. Pacho asks him to pass this information to Javier and Murphy so they can use it to try to move Pablo to another prison. Gotcha's assistant agrees and goes to meet Javier and Murphy, providing them with the information. Javier and Murphy start thinking about how to handle this information. They realize that if they announce it, Caesar will not take any action, so they decide to act on their own. They go to the newspapers and expose all the illegal activities Pablo is involved in at his prison, in an attempt to pressure Caesar into transferring Pablo to a real prison. The next day, news about the murders and illegal activities at Pablo's prison floods the media, forcing Caesar to move Pablo to a real prison. While Javier and Murphy are sitting in the embassy, happily watching the news, they are summoned to the ambassador's office, where she tells them that they leaked the photos and information about the prisoner killings without her permission, which is a violation of the rules. As a result, they are suspended from work and subjected to an investigation. Javier and Murphy are shocked by this injustice but do not protest. Later, Murphy returns home, but before he can enter, a gang kidnaps him. His wife, finding that Murphy is late, calls Javier to inform him of what happened, so he goes to the embassy to report it. He asks the military representative to handle the matter confidentially and not to inform anyone about it. After a while, the military representative comes to tell him that Murphy has disappeared and asks him to report it. Javier decides to inform the ambassador, but when he arrives at the embassy, he discovers that Murphy is indeed with the ambassador. Murphy recounts to Javier everything that happened, revealing that his kidnappers were Pacho's men with the help of Gotcha's assistant. Pacho tells Murphy that he has a recording showing his request for Carrillo to get rid of poison, which is illegal and could lead to a trial for breaking the law. Pacho demands that Murphy decide whether to cooperate with him or face being reported. Pacho gives Murphy a chance to think and lets him leave. Murphy begins investigating who leaked the information to Pacho, and he becomes convinced that Javier is the one who did it, as no one else knew these details. He tells Javier that Pacho plans to act and kill Pablo in revenge, but Murphy does not know how to achieve that. Javier denies any involvement in the situation, but Murphy does not believe him and leaves. Javier goes to a bar where he meets Gotcha's assistant, and it turns out that he is indeed involved with Pacho and his gang. We will learn more about what he does later in the second season. President Caesar, after learning of Pablo's killing of 2 prisoners, decides to transfer him from his prison to a real prison. Caesar gathers all his men to discuss how to carry out this plan and eventually decides to send a military squad led by someone named General Ariza to capture Pablo. The squad arrives at the prison but fails to capture Pablo or achieve anything. Caesar asks his assistant Eduardo to negotiate with Pablo to convince him to move to a real prison without causing trouble, with the promise of returning to his previous prison after a short period. However, Eduardo arrives at the prison and finds that Ariza's squad has the prison surrounded and cannot capture Pablo. Eduardo meets with Pablo, who tells him what President Caesar requested, but Pablo refuses and asks Eduardo to communicate with Caesar and inform him that Pablo has rejected the deal and that the army present should withdraw so Pablo can leave the prison. Eduardo communicates with Caesar and informs him of Pablo's response. At that moment, Caesar decides to send a special squad to storm the prison, kill Pablo and his men, and rescue Eduardo. Pablo learns that special forces are coming, so he decides to wait and learn more about the situation. Pablo tells Eduardo that the president has broken his promise and that he may be killed or taken hostage, providing enough reason for the squad to storm the prison and kill Pablo. He also tells him that Caesar decided to sacrifice him to get rid of Pablo. However, Pablo tells Eduardo that he will not kill him and will leave him behind, and that it might be the invading forces who kill him. Pablo then leaves the place, and no one knows where he is going. In the end, the special forces storm the prison and begin killing Pablo's men, but they do not find Pablo. They manage to reach Eduardo and rescue him, but they do not find Pablo. Instead, they only find an entrance to a tunnel beneath the prison. They realize that Pablo has escaped through the secret tunnel he had prepared, making him out of their reach. In the forest near the prison, we see a group of soldiers talking about Pablo, and one of them says that Pablo is a legendary person to the extent that he was killed before, burned, and came back to life again. Of course, this is a very fictional story, but it shows that the soldiers were very afraid of Pablo at that time. The biggest proof of that is that Pablo and his men passed in front of these soldiers, and one of them told Pablo that they were obliged to arrest him, but Pablo told him very calmly that he couldn't allow him to do that, took his men, and walked away without any of the soldiers doing anything to him. After his escape, Pablo went to the house where his mother, his wife Tata, and his children live, and began reassuring them. The next day, Pablo gathered with his men, or what was left of them, as he had lost many in the last attack on the prison. He told them that they must return to the city of Medellin, their hometown, and impose their control over the gangs there as before, so that everyone knows that Pablo has returned and is not hiding from the police. Pablo asked one of his men, named La Kika, to arrange for a car and a driver to be with him all the time so he could move around Medellin freely without anyone suspecting him. La Kika agreed and decided to proceed. But Pablo did not know that many gangs had already turned against him and would not come back under his control as before, the most important of these being the gang of Mrs. Judy Moncada. By the way, Judy is the wife of Kiko, the person whom Pablo killed in prison in the previous season when he thought he was betraying him. Now we see Judy sitting with her brother Jamie and her assistant Don Berna, telling them that they must find Pablo and kill him. She also informs them that all gangs must be told that anyone who sides with Pablo will also be killed. At this time, Don Berna thought for a moment and told Judy that he agreed with her and that they must expel Pablo. But the most important thing now is that they must stop working in their drug manufacturing labs until they can reach Pablo or the police reach him. If Pablo is at large, the police will be everywhere in the city, and they won't be able to do anything or manufacture drugs in their labs. Judy agreed with Don Berna, but Jamie was upset, as he believed they should continue manufacturing drugs as usual. Remember Jamie well for the future. We leave Judy and the others and move on to the Prisco brothers gang, known to be the most important gang in Medellin after Pablo's and Judy's gangs. The gang leader is the eldest brother, Ricardo, who was previously a doctor but chose the path of crime and began using his medical knowledge to torture his victims. Ricardo received a call from Pablo, who asked him if he was still on his side. Ricardo confirmed this. On the other hand, La Kika went to a taxi driver named Limon and asked him to be Pablo's personal driver. Limon agreed enthusiastically. For context, Limon is a taxi driver who works with brothels to transport prostitutes safely away from the eyes of the police. Limon was standing in front of one of the brothels when La Kika told him that he wanted him to bring a girl who would always be in the taxi while transporting Pablo from one place to another. Pablo would hide in the trunk of Limon's taxi, and the girl would be a decoy so that anyone who sees him would think he is transporting women, not Pablo. Limon decided to find a girl for this purpose, so he went to his neighbor and friend Maritza and offered her the job for a large amount of money. Maritza agreed because she needed the money. Limon, La Kika, and Maritza moved from the front of the brothel to go to Pablo, and a girl from the brothel saw them and was upset because she loves La Kika and thought he was cheating on her with Maritza. Remember this girl well for the future. They arrived at Pablo's location, and Maritza was blindfolded so she wouldn't know whom she was working with. Limon met Pablo, and they got acquainted. Pablo got into the trunk of Limon's taxi, and Limon began driving around. At each stop, Pablo would get out, enter a place, and meet one of his men who supplied him with money. The man told Pablo that money was scarce these days because of Judy's gang, which had prevented many gangs from working with them. Pablo became angry and told him he would deal with Judy soon, took some money, and left. While walking, people on the street recognized him, approached him, and greeted him. Pablo took out a lot of money and distributed it to the people to win their favor, as usual. In the midst of the crowd, Maritza saw Pablo and was surprised that he was the person she was helping to transport, but she didn't do anything. Elsewhere, Jamie was working in one of their drug labs and called Don Berna to tell him that he had opened the lab and was operating it. Not only that, but he also informed him that he had told Ricardo from the Prisco brothers gang about the location of the lab because Ricardo would bring his men to help protect it. Don Berna became angry and told Jamie that he was wrong to trust Ricardo. Before he could finish speaking, Jamie heard gunfire in the lab. Suddenly, Ricardo and his men, along with Pablo, entered and killed all of Jamie's men. Pablo himself killed Jamie, then spoke with Don Berna and told him he would get to him and Judy soon. Don Berna was furious and informed Judy about her brother's death, and they agreed to take revenge on Pablo no matter what. As for Pablo, he returned home after finishing his day's work. On the other side, when President Cesar Gaviria learned of Pablo's escape from prison, he went into a rage and held an emergency meeting with all his officials, ordering them to search for Pablo everywhere until they found him. Cesar appointed an army colonel named Pinzón to be responsible for capturing Pablo. We see Murphy at home, and his wife Connie is arguing with him, wanting him to return to the United States because it's not safe here. The biggest proof of that is that Pacho kidnapped him, as we saw in the previous season. Murphy tried to calm her down. After that, Javier Peña called Murphy and told him that Pablo had escaped. Murphy lost his composure, and he and Javier went to Pablo's prison to inspect it, but they found many officers and soldiers in front of the prison. A soldier told them that Colonel Pinzón, who was in charge of the case, refused to let them in until he and his men finished inspecting the prison. Murphy and Javier agreed and waited until Pinzón and his men finished their work. Afterward, they entered the prison and searched in hopes of finding anything that would help them reach Pablo, but they found nothing. They did not lose hope and went to Pinzón at his operations center and asked to join his mission to capture Pablo. Pinzón agreed and allowed them to stay at the center and work with his men. During this time, Murphy and Javier received a call from the girl at the brothel, informing them that La Kika, Pablo's assistant, would be there and they could capture him. Everyone was excited and began planning an important operation to arrest La Kika. But amidst all this, Connie called Murphy and told him something disastrous. She was at the airport and would be flying with their daughter to the United States to be safe. Connie hung up, forcing Murphy to leave Javier and the team and rush to the airport like a madman to catch his wife. When he arrived, he found out that the plane to the U.S. had already departed. He felt sad and frustrated. Murphy went into the bathroom and coincidentally saw two people using cocaine. From his experience, Murphy knew that these two were among those used by Pablo to transport drugs to the United States. Due to the situation with his wife and his extreme anger, he took out all his frustration on them, beating them until security arrived and pulled him away. Meanwhile, La Kika arrived at the brothel, and Limon was waiting outside. Shortly after, Javier arrived with a police force to arrest La Kika. The problem was that Limon saw them, so he quickly alerted La Kika, and both began to flee from Javier and his team. Javier and his team chased them, but unfortunately, they couldn't catch either of them. La Kika and Limon escaped, and Javier was extremely angry. That same night, Pablo met with the lawyer Duque, whom you might remember from the previous season, and told him he wanted to communicate with Cesar Gaviria, the president of Colombia, to try to convince him to return to his prison and reinstate the previous agreement. Duque agreed and went to talk to Cesar, but it was Eduardo Sandoval, Cesar's assistant, who responded. Duque informed Eduardo of Pablo's offer, but Eduardo didn't care and asked Duque to turn on the television to watch Cesar's new speech. Duque turned on the TV, and he and Pablo watched, surprised to see Cesar announce in his speech that the only solution to save and cleanse the country was by capturing the head of evil, Pablo Escobar. Consequently, Cesar announced a reward of $1,400,000 for anyone who helps them reach Pablo. At that moment, Pablo felt disheartened and realized that the coming days would not be easy at all. The next day, we see that La Kika goes to the brothel and keeps asking the girls there who informed on him, but of course, no one tells him anything. La Kika leaves the place as if he did nothing, while the girl who reported him is among them. At that time, we see Maritza standing among the people watching the house and the murdered girls. She realizes that La Kika must have done it and fears that he might suspect her too, so she decides to flee. On the other hand, despite President Cesar Gaviria's speech, Pablo Escobar did not surrender and hoped for negotiations with the president. Therefore, Pablo kidnaps a journalist and speaks with him in an interview, stating that he wants to make peace with Cesar and spend the remainder of his sentence in any other prison. Not only that, but he also wants to make peace with the United States and its new president, George Bush. Contrary to Pablo's expectations, Bush was strongly against drug trafficking. He appointed a new ambassador to Colombia, Arthur, who was a former commander in the U.S. Navy. Additionally, Bush appointed a person named Bill to be the head of intelligence in Colombia, and finally appointed Messina as the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, office in Colombia, effectively making her the boss of Steve Murphy and Javier Peña. Ambassador Arthur held a meeting with the embassy staff, but Murphy was not present. Arthur informed everyone that their primary goal is to eliminate Pablo and that they will be provided with all necessary resources to achieve this. He spoke with a staff member named Edward, responsible for communication surveillance, and asked him to expand his monitoring to locate Pablo. After the meeting, Javier spoke with his boss, Messina, who informed him that she intends to punish Murphy for his incident at the airport and his absence from work. Javier asked her to forgive him because he's a good and diligent officer but made a mistake due to his wife leaving him and returning to America. Messina understood and decided not to punish Murphy. Javier met with Murphy and told him about Messina's decision. Murphy was happy and went with Javier to Colonel Pinzon's operations center, where they would be working from now on. Messina sat with Murphy, admonished him for his past behavior, and warned him against causing more problems. He promised to comply. Murphy and Javier were assigned to the center to monitor any information related to Pablo. Due to the reward offered by Caesar, they received a lot of information, but most of it was misleading, orchestrated by Pablo's men. On one occasion, they went on a mission to capture Pablo at a specific house, but found no one, only a picture-mocking bush, realizing they had been tricked. Meanwhile, Limon and La Kika go to meet Pablo. Pablo speaks with Limon, telling him that any informant must be killed and that defending or hiding one is unacceptable. Then, La Kika explains to Limon that Pablo means Maritza and that she must be killed because she might have informed on them. Limon is upset because Maritza is his longtime friend, but he cannot refuse La Kika's request. First, Limon and La Kika go to pick up a bathtub that Pablo requested, remember this for later. Then they head to Maritza's house to eliminate her. They search the house, and Limon finds her but doesn't inform La Kika, telling him she isn't there and they can kill her another time. La Kika is frustrated but leaves. Maritza escapes from the house and goes to a place we'll learn about later. Back to Pablo, he receives a call from Duque, who tells him that President Caesar has agreed to meet and negotiate with him. Duque goes to the presidential palace but is surprised to be met by Attorney General Gustavo. Gustavo tells Duque that he doesn't agree with the president on killing Pablo but believes it's better to prosecute him and make an agreement. Gustavo expresses his willingness to negotiate with Pablo, making Duque happy, who then informs Pablo of the good news. Pablo isn't entirely convinced that an agreement with Gustavo will lead to a solution but decides to give it a try. Meanwhile, Javier and Murphy receive news that one of Pablo's men, La Kika, was seen purchasing a bathtub similar to the one in Pablo's prison, implying that Pablo likes this bathtub and will install it in his hideout. Excited, Javier and Murphy ask Edward, the surveillance officer, to tap into calls in the area where La Kika was spotted. Edward agrees and begins his work. Edward informs them that he intercepted a call from one of Pablo's men named Velasco and pinpointed his house location. Javier and Murphy are thrilled and ask Messina to talk to Pinzon about deploying a force to capture Pablo. Messina speaks with Pinzon, but he refuses, thinking they're wasting time. Messina contacts Ambassador Arthur, who, in turn, contacts the presidential office, forcing Pinzon to send a force with Murphy, Javier, and Messina to capture Pablo. Despite this, Pinzon is annoyed and decides to sabotage the mission. Pinzon goes out with a very large force without attempting to be discreet. Velasco notices them and alerts Pablo, who gathers his family and escapes through secret tunnels under his houses. Pinzon, his men, Javier, Murphy, and Messina enter but find no one, leaving them frustrated. The next day, Tata talks to Pablo, telling him that the police won't stop until they kill him, so he must flee the country. But escape isn't in Pablo's vocabulary, he decides to spread chaos. He sends his men throughout Medellin, declaring war on the police. Pablo's men start killing police officers by shooting and bombing, turning the city into a massive slaughterhouse for law enforcement. After these events, Pinzon can't handle it and decides to retire. Caesar attends a memorial for the fallen officers and tells his assistant, Eduardo, that he won't surrender to Pablo or negotiate with him but will continue pursuing him. Therefore, Caesar decides to bring back Colonel Horacio Carrillo to Colombia to chase Pablo. Carrillo receives the call while working at the Colombian embassy in Spain and promptly returns. Meanwhile, Pablo goes to Judy Moncada's house and takes it over with his men, but Judy and Don Berna have already escaped. Pablo captures a group of Judy's men, telling them they will either willingly or unwillingly reveal the locations of all her drug labs, or they will be killed. Frightened, they decide to confess. Speaking of Judy, she reaches Pacho Herrera's base and requests to meet his boss or business partner. Pacho agrees, and shortly after, Gilberto Rodriguez arrives in his private plane. Before explaining what Judy does with him, let's introduce Gilberto. Gilberto Rodriguez is a veteran gangster who started in the field years ago with his brother Miguel Rodriguez. Initially bank robbers, they used the money to start trading marijuana. After some time, They met Pablo and decided to ally with him in cocaine trafficking, and their business flourished. A young enthusiastic man named Pacho worked with Gilberto and Miguel, proving his worth, and they made him a partner to manage the operations. Gilberto and Miguel presented themselves as investors, economists, and businessmen, becoming societal stars. No one knew that all this was a front for their cocaine trafficking. Returning to the present, Judy meets with Gilberto, Miguel, and Pacho, telling them she wants to ally with them to eliminate Pablo. Gilberto thinks and tells Judy he has a better solution. She should inform the police about her drug lab's locations, which Pablo and his men will attempt to seize. This way, the police will take care of Pablo and his men without them having to do anything. Judy considers his words and decides to implement the plan. Meanwhile, Carrillo meets with Murphy and Javier, telling them that Medellin is full of informants working for Pablo, children who report police movements, allowing Pablo to escape. Therefore, they must capture these children one by one to prevent them from informing Pablo. When asked how to do this, he explains that it's simple. Carrillo gathers a large police force and roams the city. As he does, the child informants watch and alert each other. Carrillo continues until he reaches a square with pictures of Pablo, where he urinates on them. The news reaches Pablo, who becomes furious. Back at the center, Carrillo and Murphy speak with Edward, who tells them he intercepted signals and calls from the child informants and located them. Carrillo is overjoyed, takes Javier and a police force, and arrests all the children, the oldest being no more than 15 years old. Without hesitation, Carrillo kills one of the children and tells the others that anyone working with Pablo will meet the same fate. He gives a bullet to a child named David, instructing him to deliver it to Pablo and tell him it's the bullet that will kill him. After this, Javier and Carrillo return to the center. Javier tells Murphy what happened, and Murphy is upset because killing children is unacceptable, no matter what. The next day, David meets with Pablo and tells him everything. Pablo isn't concerned but decides to use David to tarnish Carrillo's reputation. He takes David to meet journalist Valeria, where David shares his story on camera. Pablo is pleased, believing this will expose Carrillo. Meanwhile, Don Berna contacts Javier, requesting a meeting. Javier meets him, and Berna provides the location of Judy's lab so the police can capture Pablo or at least his men. Carrillo, Javier, and Murphy raid the lab Berna mentioned, capturing many of Pablo's men, including 2 key associates. Carrillo takes the 2 men on a flight, interrogating them about Pablo's location, but they remain silent. In a fit of rage, Carrillo throws one out of the plane, then asks the second for Pablo's whereabouts. Despite his extreme fear, he refuses to betray Pablo, so Carrillo throws him out as well, without remorse. Murphy is terrified, thinking this is madness, but says nothing. The following day, David's video airs nationwide. Among the viewers are President Caesar and his assistant Eduardo. Caesar tells Eduardo that Carrillo must be held accountable if he indeed killed the child, but Eduardo convinces him to ignore it until Carrillo finishes off Pablo, after which they can deal with him. Caesar agrees. Pablo is angry and tells Duque he will write letters to all newspapers to expose Carrillo. He begins writing, hoping they'll be published, but all newspapers refuse. Frustrated, he realizes there's no hope in getting rid of Carrillo. Besides his issue with Carrillo, Pablo faces other problems, notably the Castaño brothers, led by siblings Fidel and Carlos. This is a far-right group they founded after their father was killed by communists, seeking revenge against any communist. They're heavily armed due to U.S. support. The new leadership at the U.S. embassy contacts them, asking them to eliminate Pablo, claiming he's a communist because of his previous collaboration with the M19 communist group, as seen in the previous season.
They're told that if they help eliminate Pablo, U.S. support will increase.
Seeing this as an unmissable opportunity, the brothers meet with Judy, Gilberto, and Miguel, proposing collaboration to eliminate Pablo. They're told a decision will be made later. However, Gilberto and Miguel don't need to do much, as Pablo is already falling apart, losing his men's trust, especially Limon. Limon meets with Maritza at her farm, telling her he's tired of working with Pablo and feels he could be killed at any moment. He asks her to help trap Pablo by informing the Americans of his location, promising substantial money in return. Maritza is hesitant but agrees to help. Shortly after, Gabby, a friend of Javier, contacts him, requesting a meeting. Javier meets Maritza there, who is Gabby's friend. Maritza agrees to help Javier trap Pablo, providing valuable information. Javier is delighted. The next day, Limon calls Maritza, informing her of a specific location where he and Pablo will be shortly. Limon then takes Pablo to that location. Meanwhile, Maritza informs Javier, who is thrilled and plans to go with Murphy, Carrillo, and a police force to capture Pablo. However, Messina, their boss, refuses to let them go because Ambassador Arthur instructed her to prevent them from accompanying Carrillo, fearing Carrillo's reckless actions could tarnish America's reputation. Javier and Murphy are frustrated but comply. Carrillo goes out with a force toward Pablo but fails to reach him because suddenly, a police car explodes due to a planted bomb. Trucks block the road, and Pablo's men appear, firing at Carrillo and his team. It was an ambush orchestrated by Pablo and Limon. Pablo's men eliminate everyone and wound Carrillo. Pablo himself arrives, telling Carrillo that he gave the bullet to David to deliver, and now he's using it on him. Pablo shoots Carrillo multiple times, avenging his cousin Gustavo, whom Carrillo killed in the previous season, then leaves. Unfortunately, Carrillo dies. Despite his madness and reckless actions, his primary goal was to capture Pablo, but he failed in his own way. Javier is deeply saddened, feeling responsible for Carrillo's death. Upon learning of Carrillo's death, Gilberto, Judy, and the others decide to collaborate with Fidel and Carlos to eliminate Pablo. We'll see how they cooperate later. Finally, we see Caesar with Eduardo, who tells him that Attorney General Gustavo hates him and will urge Caesar to negotiate with Pablo tonight. Realizing this can't happen, Eduardo asks Caesar to sacrifice Gustavo so he can continue his presidency until Pablo is eliminated. Caesar is reassured by Eduardo's loyalty and thanks him. Later, Maritza sits in a church, and suddenly, Limon, La Kika, and Pablo enter. She's terrified, thinking they'll kill her, but instead, they give her money to start a new life. Limon tells her he lied but secured her and her daughter's future with this money, then leaves. Meanwhile, Murphy returns home, saddened by Carrillo's death, but is somewhat uplifted when he finds his wife, Connie, has returned from America to see him. We leave them and go to Javier, who sits in a bar. Don Berna approaches him, requesting his company on an important matter. Javier goes with him to a house where Judy, Fidel, and Carlos are present. They propose collaborating with Javier to trap Pablo. Initially, Javier refuses to listen, not wanting to work with drug traffickers like Judy or extremists like Carlos and Fidel, but he eventually hears them out. They promise to help him in every way to reach and eliminate Pablo, their common enemy. To convince him, Judy gives Javier Maritza's address, telling him she's the girl who deceived him. Javier takes the address, unsure of his next move. In the following period, Pablo's life stabilizes significantly after Carrillo's death, and his business thrives more than before. Because of this, Caesar visits the police academy, attending a new class's graduation. He meets an officer named Martinez, asking him to take over the mission to find Pablo in place of Carrillo. Martinez refuses, so Caesar tells him that his son, who just graduated, has joined the mission. How could he abandon him? Realizing Caesar is manipulating him using his son, Martinez accepts the assignment. We leave them and return to Pablo, who is now settled in Carlos's house, the brother of Tata, Pablo's wife. Carlos lives in Miami, managing Pablo's operations there. Pablo tells Carlos that things are stabilizing and that he will increase operations. Therefore, Carlos will come to Colombia, and soon they'll bring Leon from America so they can meet and plan expansion. If you don't recall, Leon was the first person Pablo worked with in smuggling drugs to Miami and is currently settled there, providing money for Pablo. At the same time, Javier goes to arrest Maritza, but she tells him she was deceived just like him. Javier believes her and decides to utilize her. Shortly after, Limon meets Maritza at a restaurant. It's not important what they discussed, what's important is that Javier and a Colombian officer were surveilling the place, having arranged with Maritza to bring Limon there. After a while, Limon leaves, and Javier and the officer follow him to a house he enters. Javier sees Velasco there, who gives Limon a bag containing drugs to deliver elsewhere. Limon and Velasco leave together. Velasco speaks to Limon, then departs. Javier sees Velasco and is thrilled because he's one of Pablo's key men, suspecting there might be others at that location. He decides to bring in backup to arrest them and contacts the operations center, but they refuse since Martinez hasn't officially taken command, and no one can authorize such a force now. Frustrated, Javier decides to act on his own. He contacts Don Berna, Fidel, and Carlos, requesting their help. Shortly after, they arrive armed and enter the house with Javier and the officer. Without warning, they start shooting anyone they see. Velasco tries to escape but is caught, and they decide to take him for interrogation. Don Berna begins torturing him, but Velasco says nothing. Berna takes a document from Velasco and gives it to Judy, containing information about 3 of Pablo's accountants and about Leon, who will arrive in Colombia to meet Pablo. Judy sends the information to Gilberto to handle. The next day, we see Leon arriving in Colombia, greeted by Navegante, Pacho's assistant. Navegante takes him to Gilberto, Pacho, and Miguel. We don't know exactly what they do with Leon, but shortly after, Blackie, one of Pablo's men, informs him that Velasco has disappeared and that Leon called saying he arrived in Colombia but didn't find Velasco waiting, so he got scared and returned to Miami. Pablo is furious and orders his men to search for Velasco everywhere and bring him to him. On the other side, and at the same time, we see Steve Murphy having dinner with his wife Connie at a restaurant. We learn that Connie will soon return to America because she no longer feels safe in the country. She was only visiting Murphy. Currently, Murphy is feeling down and goes to attend the first meeting held by Colonel Martinez at the Operations Center. Martinez gathers all his men and informs them of the way they will work from now on. First, their method will be legal, and they won't commit any violations as Carrillo used to. The most important thing is that Martinez shares his new strategy to capture Pablo Escobar. When Javier Peña hears this strategy, he becomes frustrated, realizing it won't be enough to bring Pablo down, so he decides to act on his own. Peña goes to meet Don Berna and tells him that he will provide a lot of information about Escobar's hitman and other armed individuals, but he won't give any information on the locations of Escobar's labs, because he doesn't want Berna and his group to expand in the drug market. He also doesn't want to have to face them later. Berna understands Peña's reasoning, and they strike a deal. From that moment on, Peña starts passing information to Berna, who then relays it to Fidel and Carlos Castaño. The Castaño brothers descend into the city and start killing anyone associated with Escobar's men without any hesitation. They create a huge massacre among Pablo's men. Later, we see Blackie go to Escobar and tell him that there are armed men in the city killing their people, and no one knows who these men are. Around the same time, La Kika calls Pablo and informs him that the place where Velasco was located seems to have been the site of a major battle, and Velasco has disappeared. This drives Pablo crazy, and he realizes that a new war has begun, and this time, it's not with the police. On the other side, we see Gilberto Rodriguez having a meeting with Miguel Rodriguez and Pacho Herrera. They discuss how Carlos and Fidel are doing a good job, but they're also very violent. If anyone, including Pablo or anyone else, finds out that they are working with them, everyone will turn against them. Therefore, it's essential that no one knows that Carlos and Fidel are associated with them. Everyone agrees with Gilberto's plan. The next day, we see Peña and Murphy go to a location in the street, where they find Velasco's body hanging, with a large note around his neck that says, "Pablo, you and your loved ones have no safe place. Regards, Los Pepes." Los Pepes, of course, is the alias used by the group led by the Castaño brothers, Carlos and Fidel. The name Los Pepes stands for people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. That same day, Pablo is in one of his car warehouses, which has been completely burned down, obviously by Los Pepes. Pablo sits with all his men and wonders who could have done this, until he becomes convinced that it was likely Gilberto Rodriguez and his cartel. He decides to seek revenge, but only after he is 100% sure that they were responsible. Ricardo Prisco, by the way, is currently with the group and tells Pablo that Los Pepes had attacked them before and injured one of their men. The injured person is in the hospital, and since Ricardo is a doctor by training, he tells Pablo that he will find a way to reach the injured man and find out who he's working for. Pablo agrees, and they make plans to get answers. After some time, the actions of Los Pepes spread across the city, with numerous killings committed by the group. We then see Cesar Gaviria meeting with his leadership team, and they inform him that Los Pepes must be condemned for their actions, but Gaviria decides to delay dealing with them, hoping they might rid him of Pablo first. On the other hand, we see Murphy and Peña meeting with Martinez and his men, and Martinez informs them that they have managed to pinpoint a specific location where one of Escobar's men, Jairo, might be frequently visiting. Martinez decides to monitor the location until they can confirm Jairo's presence. Peña takes this information and immediately goes to meet Berna, sharing with him the location where Jairo might be, which is his mother's house, as she is ill. We see Jairo at his mother's house, and then Carlos and Fidel arrive with their men to take Jairo and kill him. By the time Peña, Martinez, and Murphy arrive at the location, Jairo is already gone. At this point, Murphy begins to suspect that something is wrong and that someone from within their organization is collaborating with Los Pepes. However, he doesn't yet know who it is. Later, the group identifies the location of another one of Pablo's men, Blackie, who regularly visits his fiancée's house. Peña informs Murphy of this, and Murphy goes to Martinez to request that they move in quickly to arrest Blackie at his fiancée's house without wasting time on surveillance. Martinez agrees and takes a team, including Peña and Murphy, to apprehend Blackie. Peña, realizing that trouble is about to happen, quickly calls Berna and orders him to tell Carlos and Fidel to stay away from the area. Immediately, Berna contacts them and tells them to leave the location quickly. At that moment, Carlos, Fidel, and their men were on their way to Blackie's fiancée's house. They try to flee, but unfortunately, they run into a police checkpoint, where Martinez's son is stationed. When he becomes suspicious of them, he orders them out of the vehicle at gunpoint. Carlos and Fidel's men also pull their guns, and Carlos manages to grab Martinez's son's weapon. The situation is about to escalate further, but Peña and Murphy arrive in time to calm things down. Peña instructs Carlos to return the weapon to Martinez's son, allowing him and his men to leave. As for Martinez, he arrives late and reprimands his son for losing his weapon, but that's not the important part. What really matters is that Murphy, after all that had happened, tells Peña that he now knows that Carlos and Fidel are behind Los Pepes and that Peña is helping them. Peña finally admits to Murphy that he is correct, and that he's doing this just to take down Pablo, nothing more. Murphy isn't fully convinced, but he doesn't say anything and lets it slide. Meanwhile, throughout all of this, Blackie manages to escape. On the other side, we see Ricardo Prisco reaching the injured man from Carlos and Fidel's gang. He tortures him to force him to reveal who he works for. Afterward, Ricardo goes to Pablo and his men, informing Pablo that Los Pepes are really Carlos and Fidel, and they are trying to kill him with the help of Gilberto Rodriguez and his cartel. At this point, Pablo goes berserk and vows to take harsh revenge on Gilberto and his allies. That same night, during the wedding of Gilberto's daughter, a bomb goes off, planted by Pablo's men. However, the bomb doesn't kill Gilberto, Pacho, or Miguel. Following this incident, they regroup and vow to retaliate by wiping out Pablo, his family, and all his men, no matter how many there are. After a few days, we see Pablo's mother deciding to leave the house to go to church to pray, even though Pablo had given strict orders that no one is to leave the house. Pablo's mother goes to church, finishes her prayers, and returns home safely. When she arrives, she finds Pablo and everyone waiting for her. They scold her for what she did because someone could have followed her and found their hideout. Just as they are arguing, Carlos and Fidel's men launch an attack, firing at the house. Pablo and his men return fire like madmen and try to escape. Many of Pablo's men die in the shootout, including Tata's brother Carlos, and she goes mad with grief. Quickly, Pablo and the remaining men escape before they too are killed and go to a safe house. In that house, Pablo tells Tata that she must take their children and leave the country to live safely elsewhere. As for him, he will stay to settle scores with the police, the Americans, Gilberto's cartel, and the Castaño brothers. He vows to take revenge on anyone who wronged him or his men. After all this, we see Pablo starting to blow up stores and properties owned by Miguel and Gilberto, seeking revenge. As for Pablo himself, we see him with his family in the house, and we learn that they are all planning to leave the country to be safe. At the same time, Ambassador Arthur and Messina are sitting with Cesar Gaviria, informing him that Pablo has booked tickets for his family and that they will be leaving. They cannot allow them to leave Colombia because they are an important pressure point against Pablo. Gaviria thinks about this and tells everyone that he will contact the foreign minister to see what can be done. Messina believes that if they wait for the foreign minister's response, Pablo's family will have already left the country. So, she contacts Murphy and asks him to go to the airport and delay Pablo's family as much as possible until the foreign minister orders that they remain in the country. Murphy agrees and heads to the airport, closely tracking Pablo's family and learning that they are traveling to Germany. He decides to travel with them on the same plane. After a short while, they arrive at the German airport. Murphy immediately goes to one of the officers and asks him to stop Pablo's family until he receives an order to send them back to Colombia. The officer agrees and goes to Pablo's family, holding them in a separate area at the airport. Murphy stays with them the entire time to keep an eye on them. On the other side, this information reaches Pablo, and he learns that his family has been detained at the airport in Germany. Furious, the first thing he does is call the German embassy in Colombia and tells them that if his family is not allowed into Germany immediately, he will kill any German citizen on Colombian soil. After ending his call with the embassy, Pablo contacts the airport in Germany and informs them that he will blow up any plane coming from Colombia to Germany if they don't immediately allow his family to enter the country. Unfortunately for Pablo, none of his attempts work. As a last resort, he contacts prosecutor Gustavo and asks him to protect his family and allow them into Germany. However, Gustavo doesn't even respond to Pablo's request and instead goes to see Gaviria, asking him to send Pablo's family back to Colombia but to ensure their protection so that they don't end up like the extremist groups that want to kill them. After all, they are only guilty of being Pablo's family. Gaviria considers this and sees it as the safest option. In Germany, officers come to Pablo's family and inform them that they will be sent back to Colombia. Meanwhile, Murphy observes everything and returns with them on the same flight to Colombia. During the flight, Tata notices Murphy's presence and realizes that he traveled with them to Germany and returned with them. She feels uneasy the whole time but doesn't say anything specific. After a short while, the plane lands in Colombia. At the airport, a force from the Colombian police arrives to take Pablo's family and ensure their safety. Away from Pablo, we see that Duque was driving his car casually when suddenly gunmen from Carlos and Fidel's group ambush him, opening fire. Duque takes cover, and the gunmen continue shooting at him, but he manages to escape. Upon his escape, Duque goes to his ex-wife's house and begs her to leave with him and their son to avoid getting killed, but his ex-wife refuses and leaves him. At that moment, Duque sees the key to his ex-wife's car, so he takes it without her knowing and drives off in her car because his car was destroyed in the shootout. He then picks up his son from school, and they head to a hotel to hide while he figures out what to do next. On the other side, Peña meets with Berna and tells him he no longer wants to work with him because Carlos and Fidel have gone mad, killing civilians and not caring about anyone. Berna assures Peña that it won't happen again and asks him for Duque's location so they can finish him off since he escaped. Peña agrees and goes to work, meeting with surveillance officer Eduardo. He asks Eduardo to locate Duque, and Eduardo does his job, returning to Peña with the location of Duque, who is hiding in a hotel with his son. At this moment, Peña reflects and realizes that Duque's son is just a child, so he decides not to hand him over to Carlos and Fidel, as they would kill him too. Instead, he offers Duque a deal. Peña meets with Duque and tells him he will protect him and his son and send them to America, but in exchange, Duque must cooperate and help take down Pablo. Duque, desperate to save his son, agrees and tells Peña he will return to him later. Afterward, we see Berna, Carlos, Fidel, and Judy Moncada meeting together. Carlos informs everyone that he knows Peña is working with them and is aware of Duque's location, but he's lying to them. Carlos now decides that he will deal with Peña, but Berna opposes him. Carlos then decides to take a different approach and asks Berna to arrange a meeting with Peña at a certain location because he wants to see him face to face. Berna does so, and that night, Peña goes to meet Berna but is surprised to find CIA officer Bill Steckner instead. Without any preamble, Bill tells Peña that he's been working with Carlos and Fidel, and it was Bill who asked them to collaborate with Peña. Bill also informs Peña that Carlos and Fidel had discovered Duque's location without his help, but if Peña doesn't assist them when they need him, they will kill him. Peña is shocked by all this and leaves the meeting, clearly shaken. Peña then goes to the hotel where Duque and his son are hiding, only to find them both dead in the trunk of a car, brutally murdered. Peña becomes furious and goes to the operations center, where he confronts Colombian officer Trejo. Trejo is the same officer who worked with Peña when they first brought Berna in to help them on a mission. Peña accuses Trejo of being the one who leaked Duque's location to Berna. Trejo confirms this, stating that he did the right thing to help bring down Pablo and anyone who supports him. Peña is enraged but leaves the situation for now. Meanwhile, on the other side, Pablo learns that his wife and family are being held by the police in Colombia. He goes into a frenzy, contacting Blackie and ordering him to plant a massive bomb near the presidential palace to send a message to President Gaviria that if he continues supporting Carlos and Fidel against him and pressures his family, his fate will be death. Blackie agrees, and his men plant a bomb near the presidential palace. The next day, in a nearby shopping mall, the bomb explodes, killing dozens of people, most of them children, as it was back to school season, and parents and children were shopping for school supplies. This horrific act turns the entire country against Pablo, as he has now crossed all lines. Even the people of his hometown, who had always supported him no matter what, have now turned against him, realizing that Pablo must be stopped. Among those watching the news and realizing that Pablo's reign is over are Gilberto, Pacho, and Miguel. They decide to make a new move in their battle against Pablo. They send Pacho to Miami to meet with Leon. We learn that Gilberto had convinced Leon to work with him instead of Pablo, and Leon agreed. Pacho arrives in Miami with his loyal aide Navegante. Leon introduces them to Pablo's accountants and smugglers, who will now work for them. This means that the entire Miami operation is now under Pacho's control, along with the rest of the cartel. As for Leon, on one occasion, Pacho brought him to the hotel where he was staying, And without any preamble, Navigante attacked and killed him. This was done to maintain control over the operations in Miami and to prevent Pablo from thinking about returning to that business again. Moving away from Pacho, we now turn to Pablo, where we see him communicating with Attorney General Gustavo. Gustavo tells Pablo that what he has done recently is madness and that he must surrender to avoid further consequences. Pablo agrees on the condition that his family leaves Colombia and is safe. Tata informs him that Gustavo will try to find a solution and will let him know soon. But I'd like to tell you, my friend, that Gustavo didn't reach any result. He goes to meet President Cesar Gaviria and asks him to allow Pablo's family to leave to a safe place in exchange for Pablo surrendering himself. But Cesar completely refuses and tells Gustavo that he doesn't intend to arrest Pablo but plans to eliminate him entirely. As for Pablo, he wasn't comfortable with this situation, so he sent Blackie to the hotel where Tata and his family were being held, to keep a close watch and ensure that his family was always safe. But the problem is that Blackie gets arrested. When he's captured, Javier Peña and Steve Murphy take over the interrogation. They tell him he could be sentenced to death or help them capture Pablo in exchange for a reduced sentence or acquittal. But Blackie completely refuses to betray Pablo. Murphy and Javier decide to get any information they can from him about La Kika. On the other side, we see Judy Moncada and Don Berna going to meet a gang called the Galeano Gang, one of the most important gangs in the city of Medellin. Judy agrees with them to join her in the Los Pepes group instead of Pablo. The gang agrees, and they decide to hold a meeting with Judy, Berna, and the Los Pepes gang at a specific place after a few days to arrange their operations. However, one of the members of the Galeano gang named Hector goes to meet La Kika and tells him everything that happened. In turn, La Kika goes to Pablo and informs him of all the details, letting him know that the Galeano gang agreed with Judy to betray him, even though they were on his side. La Kika also tells them about the scheduled meeting place after a few days to arrange business matters. Pablo thinks for a moment and then orders La Kika and Limon to closely monitor the place and learn everything about it because on the day of the meeting between the Galeano gang, Judy, and Los Pepes, Pablo plans to attack the location with his remaining men and eliminate everyone. He instructs the accountant to provide as much money as possible to hire men and buy weapons to assist them. Everyone agrees with him and decides to execute the plan. We see that La Kika and Limon indeed go to surveil the place where Judy and her associates will meet with the Galeano gang. Now, my friend, let's shift from all these events and focus on Tata. Tata desperately wants to talk to Pablo in any way possible because she and his family are being held in a hotel under constant surveillance by officers, and they know nothing about Pablo. She contacts the journalist Valeria and asks for her help to communicate with him. Valeria goes to meet Pablo, who gives her a bag containing a wireless communication device and money to give to Tata when she meets her at the hotel, under the pretense of conducting an interview. Pablo offers Valeria a lot of money to carry out this mission, but she refuses and tells him that since she met him, she has truly loved him and has never helped him for money. Pablo thanks her for that. Valeria then goes to the hotel where Tata is staying and meets her under the guise of conducting an interview, but in reality, she gives her the wireless communication device. Tata begins to communicate with Pablo naturally without anyone knowing. Everything is going well until the next day when Tata finds the police everywhere in front of the hotel. She goes down to see what's happening and discovers that Valeria has been killed in her car, left in front of the hotel. Of course, those who did this are Los Pepes. Tata completely breaks down and contacts Pablo to tell him what happened. The death of Valeria drives Pablo literally crazy, so he gathers his men La Kika, Limon, Ricardo, and the accountant, and tells them they must now go and collect all the money from their hideouts and go to Ricardo's men so that Ricardo can gather them and bring all this money to attack the Los Pepes group and Judy and her gang. Everyone agrees with him. La Kika, the accountant, and Ricardo go to get the money, leaving only Limon with Pablo. At this time, Javier Peña, Steve Murphy, and all the police officers in Medellin are trying to reach La Kika by tracking his phone, which they obtained from Blackie after he decided to turn over La Kika, as I mentioned to you. Currently, Javier and Murphy are trying to call La Kika to determine his location, and indeed, La Kika answers his phone. They manage to pinpoint his location in the city and move toward him. At that moment, La Kika was with Ricardo and the accountant in a hideout collecting money, but suddenly La Kika kills Ricardo and the accountant, takes the money, and we find out that he decided to escape, abandoning Pablo and betraying everyone. But that doesn't happen. Murphy, Javier, and the police catch up and manage to arrest him. After these events, Javier and Murphy interrogate La Kika, who decides to turn in Pablo to get a reduced sentence. He tells them that Pablo and Limon are currently heading to a specific place where Ricardo's men are gathering, to take them and then attack Judy and the Los Pepes gang. To confirm his information, La Kika calls Pablo and Limon to verify if they are going to Ricardo's men. At that moment, Pablo and Limon are indeed in the car on their way to Ricardo's men, but Pablo senses that La Kika's way of speaking has changed. With his years of experience, he immediately realizes that La Kika has been captured and is trying to betray him. He decides to flee immediately and has Limon change direction. As for Ricardo's men, they were indeed in a hideout, and we see Javier, Murphy, and the rest of the police surveilling them. When they notice that Pablo is late and hasn't arrived, they realize he isn't coming at all. They immediately attack these men, eliminating many and arresting others. Pablo continues on his way with Limon, not knowing what awaits them next or how they'll handle all these troubles. After a short while, Pablo and Limon arrive at a farm, where Pablo meets an old man. Pablo sits with this man and talks to him, and from their conversation, we learn that this old man is Pablo's father. We also find out that he had separated from Pablo's mother a long time ago and has been living peacefully on his farm, uninvolved in crime or anything else. Pablo asks to hide there for a few days, and despite not approving of his son's path at all, his father agrees because he's his son. Now, my friend, since Pablo arrived at his father's place, he has disappeared completely, and no one knows anything about him. Consequently, everything changes in Medellin. For instance, the Los Pepes group no longer plays any role in the city, but they were controlling several drug labs belonging to Pablo and Judy, which contained a lot of drugs. Based on this, the brothers Carlos and Fidel, leaders of Los Pepes, contacted Gilberto Rodriguez and informed him that their work was done and that they now have many cocaine labs. They asked Gilberto what they should do. Without hesitation, Gilberto tells them that this cocaine is now theirs, and they can sell it and use the money to support their group to resume fighting the communists. We learn that Gilberto is doing this not to support Carlos and Fidel but to ignite a war between them and Judy to eliminate her as well, leaving Medellin entirely for Gilberto. What Gilberto wants happens exactly. Carlos and Fidel discuss that the drug trade will be very profitable for them, and since they have many labs, they can produce and sell, but they must eliminate Judy entirely so she doesn't compete with them in their business. Speaking of Judy, one day she was about to take her car and go on a trip, but suddenly the car explodes. Judy isn't harmed, but she realizes that Carlos and Fidel tried to eliminate her. She tells Don Berna that she will turn in Carlos, Fidel, and Gilberto's gang to Javier Peña because she's certain they ordered Carlos and Fidel to kill her. Berna didn't like Judy's talk very much and saw that she had become an informant. However, he still does what she asks, bringing in Javier Peña. Javier makes an agreement with Judy Moncada that he will protect her and grant her immunity, but she must hand over the Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela cartel and Los Pepes gang. Javier agrees and leaves. After that, Javier goes to meet with his boss, Messina, and tells her everything that happened. Messina agrees to set up a meeting with Judy to get all the information that will help them take down Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela, Carlos Letter, and Fidel Castaño. After that, they will grant her immunity. Javier informs Messina that he will work on this important matter and then leaves. Up to this point, everything was going well, but everything changed when Berna went to meet with Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela, Pacho Herrera, and Miguel Rodriguez Orihuela. He informs them that he wants to work with them instead of Judy Moncada because Judy has become an informant, and he doesn't work with informants or snitches. Gilberto and the others are pleased and make an agreement with Berna. Then, Berna takes Judy under the pretense that they are going to meet Javier at a location so she can confess and receive immunity. But Berna doesn't go to Javier. Instead, he goes to a place with armed men, including Fidel Castaño and Carlos Letter, and a CIA plane. Berna then tells Judy that he has agreed with Gilberto to manage the business in Medellin on his behalf, and Carlos and Fidel will work with him. The profits will be divided among them. As for Judy, she won't be killed and can be an informant as she wants, but not for Javier and the DEA, rather for Bill Steckner and the CIA. Of course, Bill and the CIA have an agreement with Carlos and Fidel and don't want to lose it. Judy is shocked by all this but is forced to agree reluctantly to Berna's terms. She boards the plane and leaves with the American intelligence agents. Meanwhile, we see that Javier was waiting for Judy at a location, but she doesn't show up. Javier goes to the embassy and finds Bill waiting for him. Bill informs Javier that he was wrong to think about making a deal with Judy behind his back, so he took Judy from him and will make her work with him. Bill tells him that Judy will now appear on a program and will talk about a lot of information she knows about the drug world, including information about a DEA agent collaborating with her in Los Pepes, obviously referring to Javier. He also informs him that because of all this, Messina has been transferred to another location, and he must go to the ambassador now because the ambassador intends to send him back to America. When Javier hears all this, he becomes furious and asks Bill, "Who are you protecting? Are you protecting Carlos and Fidel to fight the communists, or are you also protecting Gilberto and his cartel?" Bill tells Javier that he is not protecting Gilberto and his cartel, but he doesn't want them to fall right now because he needs them very much. Bill then leaves Javier calmly and walks away. Javier is very confused and doesn't know what to do or what will happen to him next. Elsewhere, we see Tata, Pablo Escobar's wife, always trying to communicate with him but can't reach him at all because, by the way, Pablo's father's farm has no network coverage. On one occasion, a police officer protecting Tata and Pablo's family sees Tata trying to communicate with Pablo and also learns the frequency she uses to contact him. He takes this information and goes to meet Steve Murphy and informs him. Murphy is thrilled and gathers Colonel Hugo Martinez and the other officers. They agree to monitor these frequencies very closely until Pablo manages to communicate with Tata, and then they will determine his location and eliminate him. Speaking of Pablo, we see that he is living a very quiet life with his father and Limon on the farm. But what always worried Pablo was that he couldn't communicate with his wife at all. One time, Pablo is with his father, and his father tells him that he is ashamed of him for being a killer and a criminal. This upsets Pablo greatly, so he decides to leave the farm entirely. Pablo calls Limon and informs him that there is a certain tree on the farm under which a lot of money is buried. He asks Limon to bring this money urgently so they can leave. Limon agrees and goes to the tree, digs, and brings the money. But the problem is that the money is ruined because water reached it. Limon feels distressed and decides to find any money for himself so that if he wants to leave Pablo, he can do so. To get money, Limon goes to Maritza, if you remember her, and asks her about the money she took from them. Maritza tells him that the money has been spent, but Limon doesn't believe her and keeps searching for the money until he finds it. Limon becomes angry, and in a moment of rage, he kills Maritza, leaves her body next to her little daughter, and escapes. After that, Limon returns to Pablo and informs him that the money is completely ruined and there wasn't any intact money in the bag, which contained approximately $6,000. Of course, Pablo doesn't believe Limon and thinks he's deceiving him, but he doesn't do anything. Without wasting time, Limon and Pablo leave the farm and go to the city of Medellin, Pablo's birthplace. When Pablo arrives in the city, he is happy to find a signal, so he communicates with Tata and reassures her. Then Pablo goes to an old house of his, isolated from the city, and stays there, constantly communicating with his wife. But we see that there are officers monitoring the communications, among them Officer Hugo Martinez Jr., son of Colonel Martinez. Currently, they intercept the signal of Pablo's communication with his wife and learn that he is in Medellin, and very soon they will be able to reach him. On the other side, Murphy goes with Javier to the airport and bids him farewell because Javier, unfortunately, will return to America, as I mentioned to you. Indeed, Javier bids Murphy goodbye and leaves. Then Murphy meets with Martinez, Officer Jr., and the other officers, and they all learn that Pablo is in the vicinity of Medellin. They decide to increase surveillance more and more to pinpoint his exact location quickly and arrest him. Martinez goes to a meeting with President Cesar Gaviria and other officials and informs them of what happened. Gaviria asks Martinez to kill Pablo and not arrest him at all, but Martinez refuses and tells Gaviria that if Pablo surrenders, he will be arrested only, but if he resists, he will be killed. On the other side, we see that the officer who is securing Tata and Pablo's family informs Tata that protection will soon be lifted from her and the family, and thus they will be alone and anyone could harm them. The officer advises Tata to convince her husband to surrender because if he surrenders, no one will think of harming his family. At this moment, Tata is convinced by all this and continues to communicate with Pablo, asking him to surrender. Pablo tells her that he will think about it and get back to her. When Tata finishes communicating with Pablo, we see that Pablo's mother decides to leave the place and go to her son to be by his side. Indeed, she bids farewell to Tata and the children and leaves. But we see that Martinez was able to intercept the signal of this communication, and immediately informs Martinez and the officers. They now gather and learn the place where Pablo is, according to what Junior determined. They immediately go with a large force to that place, but they don't find Pablo there because Junior unfortunately pinpointed the location incorrectly. Of course, because of that, he feels very frustrated. We return to Pablo again, and we see that he is bored of staying in the house and wants to think by himself. He tells Limon that he will go out for a walk and will return. Although Limon strongly opposes him, Pablo insists on his opinion. Pablo takes his car and keeps driving until he reaches an ice cream shop he used to frequent. The memories pull him, and he gets out to buy ice cream and sits eating it while watching the city where he was raised and lived, as if he is bidding it farewell. Of course, No one recognizes Pablo at all among the people around him because his beard has grown, his appearance has changed a lot, and he has become thinner. While Pablo is sitting, he imagines his cousin Gustavo sitting next to him and keeps telling Gustavo that he misses him greatly in his life and that everything fell apart after his death. This shows, my friend, how much Pablo loved Gustavo, but he lost him. When Pablo finishes his time alone, he returns again to the house and sleeps, so he can think about what he will do and whether he will surrender or not. At that time, Junior is able to intercept that call and determines the place where Pablo is. This time, he gets it right. He goes to the place and finds Pablo in front of him. Of course, he is shocked and immediately contacts Martinez and informs him of Pablo's location. Without delay, Martinez sends a police force led by Murphy, and they go immediately to the house where Pablo is and surround him. At this moment, Pablo turns into a madman, brings out guns, and starts shooting at anyone in front of him. Limon continues to help him, but Limon takes 2 bullets and dies. Yet, Pablo keeps shooting at all the officers in complete madness until a sniper is able to hit him. Pablo falls, bleeding in a shocking scene for everyone. In his last moments, Pablo sees all the officers surrounding him while he lies helpless, realizing at that moment that everything he did in his life was meaningless if this was his end. Now, Officer Trujillo arrives, if you remember him, and shoots Pablo in the head, finishing him off completely. Pablo finally dies after terrorizing the police and the whole world. We see that the officers are unbelievably happy, to the point that they now sit and take pictures with Pablo's corpse after his death. The happiest person with all this is Murphy, who, after years of hard work, was able to reach this moment. As for Cesar Gaviria, as soon as Pablo dies, he announces this news everywhere in the country. Pablo's mother is on a bus heading to him, but she hears the news and believes it. She immediately goes to the place where Pablo died and sees her son's corpse, very saddened. As for Tata, after learning what happened to her husband, she is, of course, very upset, but she decides to act immediately. She takes herself and goes to Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela and tells him that Pablo has many properties in the city of Medellin. She offers that he can take everything Pablo owns, and in return, he provides her and her children with a life abroad because they won't be able to live in this country after everything that happened. At this moment, Gilberto agrees to her terms, and the agreement is made. Finally, we see that Gilberto meets with his men, Pacho Herrera, Miguel Rodriguez Orihuela, Berna, Fidel Castaño, and Carlos Letter, and informs them that from today, Colombia has become theirs. But don't think that things will go smoothly for Gilberto and that's it. The biggest proof of that is that we now go to Javier in America, and we see that Javier meets with police leaders who inform him that they want him to return to Colombia again and take on the case of Gilberto and his cartel, and they must take them down. Because Gilberto is very dangerous, perhaps more than Pablo himself, and he brings drugs into America more than Pablo did, so he must be stopped. Javier agrees, very happy, because he has long wanted to take down Gilberto and his associates. The drug trade in Colombia did not stop, as the Cali Cartel, led by the Rodriguez Orihuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, along with Pacho Herrera and Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, known as Chepe, emerged. They also had an alliance with Fidel and Carlos from the Los Pepes group. These leaders decided to take control of the entire cocaine trade in Colombia. Due to this escalation, Javier Peña was summoned back to Colombia, and this time his mission was to take down the Cali Cartel entirely. The new season starts with Javier in the United States, attending a family wedding. At the end of the wedding, while driving back with his father asks him about his plans for Colombia. Javier responds that he is determined to return to Colombia and chase down the Cali Cartel just like he did with Pablo Escobar. Although his father is not in favor of this and wishes for him to have a peaceful life, he still wishes him success. The next day, Javier boards the first flight to Colombia. Shortly after, he arrives at the United States Embassy in Bogotá. Upon arrival, he meets a young man named Stiedler, who informs him that he will be his new assistant. However, Javier doesn't seem to care much and heads straight to meet Ambassador Arthur. Javier asks the ambassador about Murphy, and Arthur tells him that Murphy finished his mission by taking down Pablo Escobar and returned to the United States to settle down with his family. Arthur then tells Javier that the embassy will support him in every possible way to take down the Cali Cartel and that he will have full cooperation. He also informs him that Agent Bill, who had previously hindered his work due to his connections with the Cali Cartel, will now fully assist him. Javier feels reassured and becomes more motivated for his new mission. Next, we move to the Cali Cartel, where the leadership is divided between 4 people: Pacho Herrera, who is responsible for distribution and is the least powerful of them, Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, Chepe, who lives in New York and manages the cartel's operations from there, Miguel Rodriguez, who handles finances and supervises the bribes given to officers and politicians, and finally, Gilberto Rodriguez, who is the overall leader of the cartel. In a large meeting at Gilberto's mansion, he gathers all his men, including Chepe, who flew in from New York. It's the first time they've all gathered in one place. The purpose of this gathering is that Gilberto wants to announce something very important. Now, we move to Jorge Salcedo, the head of security for Gilberto, who works alongside his colleague Cordova. Jorge talks to Cordova about his desire to leave the cartel and start his own private security firm, following the request of his wife Paula, who wants him to get out of the criminal life. At the same time, Javier is working on several cases related to the Cali Cartel. He discovers that recently, there was an attack on one of the cartel's warehouses in Miami, and a man named Lucho, who works for the cartel, was arrested. Javier decides to use this case as leverage against Lucho's brother, Andreas, and asks him to cooperate with him. Andreas is tasked with entering Gilberto's party as a waiter and recording everything that happens using a hidden camera and microphone. If he agrees, his brother Lucho will be released. During the party, Andreas starts recording everything. But before Gilberto gives his speech, Jorge intervenes and discovers what Andreas is doing. Instead of exposing him, Jorge removes the camera and microphones and warns Andreas that he must leave the city entirely or the cartel will hunt him down. Andreas agrees in fear and leaves. Later, Gilberto finally gives his speech and tells his men that he has reached an agreement with the Colombian authorities to stop the drug trade completely within 6 months. In return, they will be allowed to keep the money they have earned from the drug trade, enabling them to start legal businesses and make substantial profits. Gilberto emphasizes the need to make as much money as possible during these 6 months before completely stopping illegal activities. His speech comes as a shock to some of his men, but no one dares to object. After the speech, Miguel Rodriguez goes to speak with Maria, Claudio's wife, and it becomes clear that he is interested in her. Later, Miguel informs Jorge that he cannot quit the job until the 6 months have passed and the cartel stops its operations, leaving Jorge feeling confused and shocked. At the same time, Javier sits in a bar where Bill, the United States embassy agent, approaches him. Bill tells Javier bluntly that the cartel has reached an agreement with the government and that there is no need to chase them anymore because they will stop drug trafficking in 6 months. Javier is outraged and feels betrayed, realizing that his mission was just a cover while negotiations were happening behind the scenes. Bill leaves Javier in shock and frustration. Elsewhere, we see Duffy and Lopez, who were part of Javier's team, receiving a clear warning when they find a video showing them trying to recruit Andreas. It turns out that the Cali Cartel had been monitoring their every move. We also learn that the cartel controls all telecommunications, airports, and even the police in Cali, allowing them to spy on anyone and track their movements. In the final scenes, Miguel decides to eliminate Claudio, not only because of old disputes but also due to his interest in Maria. The crime is carried out in a brutal manner when Claudio is tied to 2 motorcycles and pulled until his limbs are torn from his body, leading to his gruesome death. At the same time, we see Gilberto's men eliminating everyone opposing his decision to end the drug trade. This way, Gilberto gets rid of all his enemies within the cartel. The next day, a group of Gilberto's men, led by David, Miguel's son, are seen with pipes filled with toxic gas. They were supposed to dispose of the gas in the pipes to fill them with cocaine and ship it to the United States, as the pipes are not inspected at the airport. However, David and his men didn't realize that the gas they removed from the pipes was leaking into nearby homes, causing a disaster. The next day, we see Gilberto sitting with Henao, who is Claudio's boss. Henao is furious about the way Pacho killed Claudio in front of people, considering it a great insult. Gilberto tries to calm Henao and promises him a large financial compensation. Henao agrees and leaves. Afterward, Gilberto speaks with Pacho and asks him to go to Mexico to run their operations there for the next 6 months to avoid local problems. Pacho reluctantly agrees. Meanwhile, Gilberto receives bad news about the gas leak incident. He fears that people might discover the cartel's involvement in the disaster, so he gathers his men, including David, and scolds them for the massive mistake. He orders them to contact Jorge to fix the problem. At the scene, a journalist named Carolina discovers that the police have found one of the pipes causing the leak, which belongs to a fake company owned by the Cali Cartel, making her realize the cartel's involvement. At the American embassy, Javier meets with Ambassador Arthur and some of Cali's police chiefs. They present photos of Duffy and Lopez with Andreas, showing that the cartel had been monitoring them. The police chiefs ask the embassy to withdraw their agents from Cali, and Arthur and Javier reluctantly agree. Later, Javier informs Duffy and Lopez that their mission in Colombia is over and they must return to the United States. They agree but feel disappointed. Later, a new officer named Chris arrives to replace Duffy and Lopez. Chris asks Javier to go to Cali to track down the cartel, but Javier refuses, feeling frustrated by the lack of progress. While stepping out for a cigarette, the journalist Carolina approaches Javier and tells him that the gas leak was caused by Gilberto and his cartel, but they will get away with it as usual, even though many children died because of the incident. Javier is shocked but doesn't respond and leaves. Elsewhere, we see Jorge with his parents and wife inspecting a piece of land he bought to build a house nearby. Later, Jorge meets Cordova and tells him they need to find a way to pressure the safety inspector overseeing the area affected by the gas leak, forcing him to blame the gas company instead of the cartel. Jorge agrees and begins searching for something to use against the inspector. After some investigation, Jorge discovers that the inspector's wife is cheating on him with another man at a hotel. Jorge goes to the hotel and takes pictures of her with her lover. He returns with the photos to Gilberto, who decides to send Cordova to blackmail the inspector, but David insists that Gilberto send Jorge instead. Jorge prefers to avoid such tasks, but he reluctantly agrees and goes to meet the inspector to blackmail him. In the end, the inspector announces on television that the gas leak was due to a problem with the gas company supplying the area, not the cartel. Javier watches the press conference and becomes furious, deciding to act against the Cali Cartel without Bill or intelligence's knowledge. He goes to Officer Chris and asks him to prepare to head to Cali to monitor the cartel. In New York, we see Chepe contacting Gilberto, telling him that he's facing some problems and wants to lay low for a while. Gilberto reassures him that everything will be fine, but Chepe informs him that he needs to resolve an issue related to securing a critical chemical for making cocaine. Chepe goes to the factory that supplies them with the chemical, but the factory manager tells him that another Dominican gang has seized the chemical by force. Chepe gets angry and demands the gang's location, then he and his men go to eliminate them. A few days later, Pacho and his younger brother Alvaro arrive in Mexico, where they are met by a man named Carrillo, who is in charge of managing the cartel's operations there. Pacho came to negotiate a deal with Carrillo regarding their last transaction before they cease operations. Carrillo takes Pacho to his home and tries to convince him not to quit the drug trade, even if Gilberto decides to stop. Pacho stays in Mexico for a few days to make his decision. Meanwhile, Javier attends a meeting with Ambassador Arthur and two United States congressmen. The congressmen have come to assess Javier's efforts in fighting drug traffickers, and based on their findings, the United States will decide how much financial support to give Colombia. We also learn that the Cali Cartel is always transferring its money from the United States to Panama, where a man named Franklin launders the money. Javier doesn't know who Franklin is, but he starts gathering information about him by threatening local companies in Colombia with cutting off United States business ties if they don't cooperate. Eventually, Javier uncovers Franklin's identity and begins monitoring him. Franklin lives in a remote area with his American wife, who is addicted to cocaine. Franklin tells his wife that he has to go to handle some business and leaves. Javier decides to monitor both Franklin and his wife to catch him. Later, Javier follows Franklin to the airport and discovers that he has bought a ticket to Panama. Javier decides to travel to Panama as well on an embassy plane. But when he gets to the airport, he finds Bill there. Bill tells him that he's not going anywhere and that he has to accompany the congressman on a trip to a specific site. In the end, Bill takes Javier and the congressman to a jungle on the Colombian border, where they are met by a military commander named Miles. There, Bill shows them the bodies of Colombian smugglers to convince the congressman of the need for United States intelligence funding to fight the traffickers. But Javier realizes that the bodies are not of smugglers but ordinary people killed to convince the congressman. Bill continues to persuade the congressman of the need for United States forces in Colombia and controlling the border, not just to fight traffickers but also to prevent the spread of communism in the region. After the meeting, Javier talks to Bill and tells him that he knows his plan is to make the Cali Cartel surrender without a fight so the United States government can focus on fighting the communists. Bill responds that this is the greatest threat to America. But Javier insists on continuing his war against the cartel, even if he has to do it alone. In Cali, Chris and another officer named Dan arrive. Their mission is to monitor companies linked to the cartel and prove they are fake businesses laundering cartel money. There, they meet a corrupt Colombian officer named Calderon, who claims to hate the Cali Cartel and offers to help them take it down. At this time, Calderon takes them on a tour of the companies they came to inspect. Elsewhere, we see Jorge welcoming an American lawyer named Starkman and taking him to meet with Gilberto, Miguel, and their accountant, Palomari. We learn that Starkman came to finalize a significant deal with Gilberto and Miguel, so much so that Palomari leaves to prepare the paperwork and organize the money. The problem now is that Dan, Chris, and Calderon arrive at the building where Palomari's office is located and decide to inspect it. Calderon is shocked, as he wasn't prepared for this and cannot warn the cartel since he is playing a double role, as I mentioned earlier. After much thought, Calderon decides to accompany them during the inspection to maintain their trust. One of Jorge's men sees what is happening and informs him. Jorge panics and immediately calls Palomari, warning him to hide any money or incriminating documents before the police arrive. However, Palomari doesn't care and hangs up on him. Jorge drives recklessly, speeding to Palomari's office to get there before the police. When he arrives, he finds the police about to enter, so he rushes into the office and hides the money and any incriminating documents. Then, he hides in the office. The police enter with Dan, Chris, and Calderon, but they find no money, only some papers and files, which they take and leave. After this, they all head to the station where Calderon works, and they inform him that they want to take the files to the embassy for review, but Calderon refuses. At this point, they realize that Calderon is a traitor working with the cartel, but they don't act on this for the time being and leave. Jorge then goes to meet Cordova and tells him what happened, asking him to ensure that Palomari listens to him in the future. Jorge leaves, angry, and goes to meet with potential investors interested in investing in his security company, which he plans to launch after leaving the cartel. While sitting with the investors and his wife, Paula, David, Miguel's son, arrives and enters the restaurant. When David sees Jorge, he walks toward him and greets him in a way that suggests they are working together. The investors notice this and decide not to invest in his company, infuriating Jorge. It's unclear what he intends to do about David after this incident. We return to Dan and Chris, who head back to the embassy in another city, not Cali. While at the airport, Dan realizes something important. Palomari is from Chile, and since there is an extradition agreement between Chile and the United States, they can arrest and extradite him to the United States. The two decide to return to Palomari's office and arrest him, then get him to testify against Gilberto and the cartel. They follow Palomari and watch him meet with Cordova and get into a car with him. They tail them to a certain house and wait outside. After a while, they exit, and the two plan to arrest Palomari, but they are surprised when Gilberto appears. They immediately call Javier and inform him that they've found Gilberto, who is hiding in this house until he finalizes a deal with the government. Upon hearing this, Javier meets with Officer Martinez and tells him that they can now track down and arrest Gilberto. Martinez is shocked, and it's unclear what he will do next. Elsewhere, Maria meets with Miguel and tells him that she wants her son, who is being kept by Claudio's mother, and in return, she might agree to marry him. Miguel agrees and allows her to stay in a private apartment until he can retrieve her son. The next day, Miguel contacts Jorge and asks him to go with Navagente to retrieve the child from Claudio's mother. Jorge agrees, and he and Navagente head to Claudio's mother's house. Jorge speaks with her, asking her to hand over the child without any trouble, but she refuses, saying that Maria took advantage of her son's death. At this point, Claudio's brothers show up and hold Jorge captive, planning to kill him. However, Navagente intervenes just in time, restraining the mother and her sons and forcing them to hand over the child. They take the child and leave without being harmed. Meanwhile, we see Martinez and his men preparing to head to Gilberto's hideout, hiding inside a large truck loaded with chickens to avoid detection by corrupt Cali police. During this time, we see Javier, Chris, and Dan with Calderon, tricking him into thinking they are going to raid a certain house to keep him distracted and prevent him from interfering with their plan. After raiding the fake house, they find nothing, and Calderon decides to return to the station. But Javier leads him to Gilberto's house by giving him certain directions until Calderon finds himself in front of the house where Gilberto is hiding. Calderon is shocked and realizes the truth. Martinez arrives at the house and explains to Calderon that they had to bring him along so he wouldn't interfere, and they place him under the guard of a soldier. Martinez, Javier, Chris, and Dan enter the house and search it until Javier finds a secret room where Gilberto is hiding. They arrest him, but Calderon manages to escape after tricking the soldier guarding him. Calderon calls the corrupt police and asks them to send a large force to pursue Javier and his team. The corrupt police begin chasing them, but Javier and his team manage to escape and reach the airport, where they take Gilberto with them and leave Cali. Later, the new president of Colombia, Ernesto, meets with his leaders, Javier, Bill, and some United States officials to discuss what should be done with Gilberto. Some leaders suggest releasing him and completing the deal, but Ernesto refuses and decides to imprison him. As Javier leaves the meeting, He finds a small note saying, "You ruined everything. Face the consequences." Javier knows that Bill left him this message, but he doesn't care much. Javier returns to his work, where he meets Martinez, who tells him that he will have to leave the police because one of the corrupt leaders accused him of bribery due to his involvement in Gilberto's arrest. Javier is shocked and apologizes to Martinez, but Martinez asks him to keep pursuing the cartel no matter what happens. Meanwhile, we see Miguel meeting with his men, including Jorge, and asking them to tighten security in the coming period until things calm down. Miguel contacts Pacho and Chepe, asking them to stay in their locations and not return to the United States until the situation stabilizes. As for Gilberto, we see him in prison, where he is visited by his son, Nicholas, who will be handling his defense. Gilberto seems to be in denial, believing he will be released soon, but Nicholas tries to convince him that he needs to prepare for trial. At the same time, Javier attends a meeting with police leaders and the Minister of the Interior, who blames him for getting involved in all this trouble and asks him to quickly work on arresting the remaining cartel leaders, or else they will face a wave of violence like the one that happened during Pablo Escobar's time. Javier feels cornered but promises the minister that he will be able to arrest the remaining leaders soon. Later, Javier holds a meeting with the Minister of Defense, who tells him that they need to find a witness to testify against Gilberto so they can sentence him to a long-term prison sentence. Javier responds that he's working on it and will bring a witness soon. Shortly after these events, we see Javier and his assistant monitoring a phone call from Cristina, who is Franklin's wife, the man responsible for laundering the cartel's money. Javier was anxiously waiting to find Franklin's location, but unfortunately, he couldn't pinpoint it. Therefore, Javier decides to go to a cafe where Cristina is sitting, and he introduces himself as an American officer, asking to speak with her for a moment. Cristina refuses and leaves. Javier doesn't give up and follows her to her home, asking her to listen to him for just a few minutes. Finally, Cristina agrees to talk to Javier. During their conversation, Javier tells her that she needs to convince her husband, Franklin, to turn himself in and disclose everything he knows about Gilberto. In return, their charges would be reduced since Cristina herself was involved in some of the money laundering activities her husband was conducting. Cristina feels anxious but agrees to think it over and tells Javier that she will talk to Franklin. Later, Javier listens to another phone call between Cristina and her husband, Franklin. Cristina tries to convince Franklin to turn himself in, but he refuses. What catches Javier's attention in this call is not Franklin's refusal but the language he was speaking, allowing Javier to identify the country Franklin was in, a Caribbean island. With this discovery, Javier is able to pinpoint Franklin's location and decides to go after him to make an arrest. The next day, we see Javier at the airport, speaking to Cristina on the phone. She tells him that she will try once more with Franklin and asks him to wait a little longer. Javier agrees to give her some time, but at the same time, he prepares to board a plane to the location where Franklin is residing. We will see in the upcoming events whether Javier succeeds in capturing Franklin or not. Meanwhile, we see Gilberto calling his brother Miguel from prison. Gilberto asks Miguel to invite Henao to a meeting and inform him that everything is going smoothly and that Gilberto's arrest will not affect the business operations. Gilberto knows that Henao is very angry about the current situation and may take the opportunity to cause trouble, so he wants to calm him down. Miguel agrees with what Gilberto said and informs him that he suspects there is a traitor among them, the person who informed the government of Gilberto's hideout. Gilberto asks Miguel to investigate and find out the traitor's identity. Miguel agrees and ends the call with his brother. After that, we see Miguel hosting Henao at his home. By chance, Henao spots Maria and her son in Miguel's house, which enrages him, but he doesn't do anything and leaves. We don't yet know what Henao is planning. Meanwhile, Gilberto meets with his lawyer and his son, Nicholas, and they attempt to contact Mr. Medina, but they are unable to reach him. Mr. Medina is an important government official and the one who negotiated Gilberto's surrender in exchange for keeping his legal assets. Nicholas suggests that he go meet with Medina himself to reach an agreement, but Gilberto refuses, not wanting Nicholas to get further involved with cartel matters. Nonetheless, Nicholas goes to meet with Medina alone and manages to renegotiate with him. Later, Nicholas visits his father in prison and informs him that he has reached a new agreement with Medina. The deal stipulates that Gilberto, Chepe, Miguel, and Pacho will be imprisoned for only 3 years, while the state will confiscate all their illegal assets. However, their legal assets and money will remain theirs. Although Gilberto dislikes the idea of prison, he reluctantly agrees to the deal. At the same time, we see Miguel meeting with Jorge and Cordova, telling them he suspects there is a traitor among them who informed the authorities of Gilberto's location. He asks them to start searching for the traitor. Jorge and Cordova begin investigating. They go to the communications center and listen in on the calls made the day Gilberto was arrested, but they find nothing revealing the informant's identity. Next, they interrogate Calderon, but he denies being the informant. He explains that Dan and Chris found Gilberto's location by following Palomari when he visited Gilberto at his home. At this moment, Cordova becomes anxious because he was with Palomari that day, and he fears being suspected. After some thought, Cordova decides to pin the blame on Calderon and tells Jorge that he will inform everyone that Calderon is the traitor. Jorge agrees to this solution, and it seems like everything is under control. However, later that same day, Jorge receives a call from David, who asks him to come immediately to Miguel's house. When he arrives, David greets him and tells him that Miguel wants to see him. David reveals to Jorge that they've discovered Calderon as a traitor and have decided to kill him. Indeed, David takes Jorge to a room where Calderon is being held and tortured, then David and his men kill him in a shocking scene. But the biggest surprise comes when David takes Jorge to another room, where he finds Cordova being held and tortured. David tells him that Cordova tried to flee the city with his family, which made him suspicious that Cordova was the informant. In reality, Cordova wasn't the informant but was scared and wanted to protect himself and his family. In a bloody scene, David kills Cordova and his family. Afterward, Miguel arrives and tells Jorge that he is now the cartel's sole head of security, and he asks him to take his responsibilities very seriously in the coming period. Jorge is horrified after seeing Cordova and his family's bodies and decides that he can no longer work with the cartel, as they could kill him and his family at any moment. After making this decision, Jorge goes to a phone booth and calls Dan and Chris, informing them that he wants to cooperate with them. The next day, Jorge meets Dan and Chris at a safe location on the city's outskirts and tells them that he wants to testify against the Cali Cartel, but in return, he demands protection for himself and his family and that they be relocated to the United States. Dan and Chris tell him that he must hand over one of the cartel leaders, such as Miguel, to secure full immunity. After this meeting, Jorge returns to the city and continues his work with the cartel. He meets with his men and gives them the necessary instructions, as there is a major festival expected in the city, which means the situation could become chaotic. Jorge then talks to David, Miguel's son, who informs him that he has become his father's personal bodyguard and that even Jorge doesn't know where Miguel is, making it even harder for Jorge to locate him. At that moment, Nicholas, Gilberto's son, arrives and tells his uncle Miguel about the new deal his father, Gilberto, made with the government. He also informs them that the police now know Palomari well, so they need to eliminate him quickly. After some thought, Miguel decides not to kill Palomari but to move him to a safe location. Nicholas agrees with this plan and leaves. David then talks to Miguel, asking him to attend the festival being held that day, believing that his presence will help bolster his image as the new leader. Miguel agrees with the idea and tells David to inform Jorge to ensure the place is secure. Jorge organizes all the security arrangements and then heads to a phone booth, where he calls Chris and Dan, telling them that Miguel will be at the casino tonight, giving them the opportunity to come and arrest him. At that moment, both Chris and Dan begin to feel uneasy and suspicious of Jorge, as mentioned before. They decide not to attempt to arrest Miguel that night but instead go to the casino to observe the situation and confirm Jorge's information. At the same time, we see Henao sitting with Claudio's mother and brothers, while communicating with Carrillo in Mexico. Henao agrees with Carrillo that once the Cali Cartel falls, he will continue working with him. In return, Henao wants Carrillo to hand over Pacho so he can take revenge for Claudio's death. Carrillo agrees to this request and decides to hand over Pacho. That night, Pacho and his brother Alvaro are at one of Carrillo's villas when suddenly Henao's men attack them and open fire. A huge chaos breaks out in the villa, with many of Pacho's men being killed and his brother Alvaro getting injured. However, thanks to his experience, Pacho manages to kill all of Henao's men, then takes his injured brother and escapes to the United States by plane. On the other side, Miguel arrives at the casino where the festivities are taking place, and everything seems normal. During the event, Jorge notices the presence of Chris and some armed men. Jorge starts to feel suspicious and believes that these men came to arrest Miguel. He heads to the bathroom to speak with Chris and asks him about his plan to arrest Miguel. However, Chris seems surprised and tells him that he didn't come to arrest Miguel but only to verify the accuracy of Jorge's information. At that moment, Jorge realizes that the armed men are not with Chris but with Henao's cartel, and they came to seek revenge on Miguel. Quickly, Jorge tries to get Miguel out of the casino, but the gunfire starts before they can leave. Despite the chaos, Jorge manages to get Miguel out safely, and they take him home. At home, Miguel thanks Jorge for saving him and officially appoints him as head of security instead of David, giving Jorge more power and allowing him to always know Miguel's location. Afterward, Jorge goes to Chris and Dan and hands them a paper listing the places Miguel is expected to frequent in the coming days. Chris and Dan ask Jorge about the fate of Cordova, the former head of security. Jorge explains that the cartel killed Cordova and his family and that he wants to ally with them before he and his family are killed too. Although he doesn't tell them everything, Chris and Dan begin to trust him gradually and decide to cooperate with him. Then, we leave Colombia and move to the United States. There, we see the Dominican cartel's lab, which Chepe had previously taken control of, experience a massive explosion due to a mistake made by one of the workers. Later, we see Chepe sitting with his wife, and it seems he has no intention of leaving the United States, since everyone believes the lab belongs to the Dominican cartel and is not connected to the Cali Cartel. However, Chepe's opinion completely changes when he sees a news report on TV linking the lab to the Cali Cartel. Furious, Chepe decides to head to the restaurant where the journalist who published the story is sitting and kills him, then flies to Colombia. In the Caribbean, we see Javier arriving and meeting with the local police. He strikes a deal with them to arrest Franklin. Indeed, Javier and the police set out to search for Franklin and find him at a restaurant. Franklin tries to flee, but Javier chases him down and successfully apprehends him. Later, we see Javier with Franklin on a plane as they head back to Colombia. They agree that Franklin will confess everything in exchange for protection for his wife, Cristina. Meanwhile, we see Cristina in a beauty salon buying drugs, as she is addicted. After leaving the salon, she returns home but notices officers in front of her house, prompting her to flee immediately, thinking they came to arrest her. She tries to call Franklin in the Caribbean but cannot reach him, so she resorts to calling Javier to understand what's happening. Javier tells her that the officers she saw at her home were there to protect her and asks her to come to the United States Embassy immediately for her safety. Cristina agrees and begins heading to the embassy with the help of the drug dealer she was buying from. Suddenly, Navagente appears and kills the drug dealer, shocking Cristina. At the United States Embassy, Starkman, the lawyer, meets with Javier and talks with him briefly before informing him that Cristina has not arrived at the embassy and is not in a safe place as Javier had promised Franklin, which leads to the deal being cancelled. Javier becomes concerned because he now has no witness to convict Gilberto, meaning Gilberto could easily be released from prison. We switch to Gilberto, who contacts Miguel and tells him that Henao and his cartel attempted to kill him and Pacho. He informs Miguel that he is preparing to go to war against Henao's cartel to eliminate them. However, Gilberto disapproves of this decision and urges Miguel to wait until the deal with the government is finalized. Miguel agrees with Gilberto but, in reality, has no intention of following this request. This becomes evident when we see Miguel meeting with Pacho and Chepe after they return to the United States, informing them that he has decided to go to war against Henao's cartel. Everyone agrees with the decision, and the next day, Miguel starts his war. We see a group of Henao's men in a church listening to a sermon from the priest when they suddenly hear gunfire outside the church. Some men go outside to investigate, only to be ambushed and killed. Shortly after, Pacho storms the church and tells the congregation that they must hand over Claudio's mother and her sons, or the city will face daily bombings and killings. Pacho leaves the church, leaving everyone in shock. Now, we are introduced to Henao's cartel, known as the Northern Valley Cartel, which controls the border town of Northern Valley. This town contains a port that is one of the most critical hubs for drug trafficking, distributing narcotics worldwide. Additionally, money flows from various places into this port. In other words, whoever controls this port controls the drug trade in Colombia and possibly the entire world. The Northern Valley Cartel leaders are 4 individuals, including Claudio's mother and Henao, who is the cartel's main leader. After learning about the importance of the Northern Valley Cartel, we return to Miguel, Pacho, and Chepe, who gather and decide that they must defeat Henao's cartel and take control of the port, which serves as the cartel's main hub for its operations. Everyone agrees on Miguel's plan, and they begin strategizing how to execute it. At this point, Jorge meets with Chris and Dan and informs them that Miguel has moved to a different house from the one he was hiding in previously. Jorge also tells them that he doesn't know the details of this house very well and isn't sure if Miguel has built any secret hideouts there. Jorge assures them that he will be near the house and will remain there until the police arrive. He emphasizes that, as the head of security for the cartel, he is supposed to warn Miguel if the police approach, but now that he's cooperating with them, they can carry out the plan without Miguel being alerted. Chris and Dan agree to Jorge's plan. Later, Javier and Ambassador Arthur meet with the Minister of Defense and request that he form a special forces unit to arrest Miguel. The minister agrees, and Javier goes to meet General Serrano, a highly respected and patriotic officer. Javier asks Serrano to lead the operation, as they need a trustworthy team that isn't compromised by cartel corruption. Serrano agrees, and Javier and his team begin planning the operation step by step. Everyone agrees to move in by helicopter, with Javier accompanying a force led by Serrano's men, while another team led by Chris and Dan arrives by car. Jorge will be near the house to guide them to Miguel and ensure they arrest him before he can receive any warning. After finalizing the plan, Jorge goes home to inform his wife of what's about to happen. To his surprise, he finds his wife packing their bags and taking the kids, as she no longer feels safe. Jorge tries to convince her to stay until he finishes his mission so they can escape together, and she agrees to wait. Jorge heads to the area near Miguel's house, where he meets one of his men, Enrique, who had been guarding the place. Jorge tells Enrique that he'll take over the night's guard duty, and Enrique leaves. Before he goes, Jorge receives a call from Miguel, who asks him to come to the house immediately. Jorge feels frustrated but complies and heads to Miguel's house. Upon arrival, Miguel asks him to monitor Gilberto's phone in prison, as he's starting to lose trust in him. Jorge tries to leave to return to his post, but Miguel insists that he stay for dinner. Reluctantly, Jorge agrees. While they're having dinner, Jorge notices that Felito, Miguel's personal assistant, is carrying a walkie-talkie, meaning that if Enrique spots the police, he will notify them immediately. Jorge becomes worried and decides to disable the walkie-talkie. He asks Miguel to fetch something for him and quickly disables Felito's walkie-talkie without anyone noticing. At that moment, the police pass by Enrique, and he tries to alert Miguel, but no one responds. Meanwhile, in Miguel's house, they hear the sound of a helicopter approaching, and Miguel realizes the police are coming. He asks Jorge to go outside and see what's going on, but Jorge tries to stay with him to learn his plan. Miguel insists, and Jorge leaves, meeting the police outside while Miguel hides inside the house. A few moments later, Javier, Chris, Dan, and the special forces arrive at the house and begin searching, but they can't find Miguel. Finally, they notice that the bathroom wall seems strange and realize that Miguel is hiding behind it. Indeed, Miguel is hiding in a small space behind the wall, wearing an oxygen mask since there's no air in the space. The officers begin demolishing the wall to reach Miguel. Meanwhile, David receives word of the raid and rushes to the Deputy Attorney General, a corrupt official who receives money from the cartel. David takes the Deputy Attorney General from the golf course where he was practicing and forces him to go stop the operation. The Deputy Attorney General arrives at Miguel's house and halts the officers, claiming they don't have an official warrant to arrest Miguel. Everyone stops and leaves the house, extremely frustrated. Miguel emerges from his hideout, but is deeply shaken by the incident. His paranoia grows, especially after receiving a call from Gilberto in prison, urging him to surrender. Miguel vehemently refuses, telling Gilberto that he will never surrender. Miguel proves he is serious about his decision, as we see Pacho, Chepe, and their men attack the Northern Valley Cartel's port and completely seize control of it. At the same time, Jorge contacts Chris and asks him to help him and his family escape the city to the United States. As promised, fearing that Miguel will discover his betrayal and kill him. However, Chris informs him that the mission failed, and thus their deal is off, leaving Jorge furious. Jorge returns home to find that his wife and children have left and gone to her father's house. Jorge isn't too concerned about this and begins preparing his gun, which he hasn't used in years. Despite being the head of security for the cartel, Jorge has never killed anyone and hasn't used his gun, but it seems he is now ready to change his principles. After everything that happened, we turn to Cristina, where we discover that Navagente has kidnapped her and handed her over to an armed group. This group is a communist insurgency working with the Cali Cartel, hiding anyone the cartel wants to disappear in the jungle where they reside. This detail will become important in the events to come. The next day, Javier meets with the Colombian Minister of Defense, who informs him that his mission has failed and that the Americans will not be allowed to conduct any more operations. However, Javier tells the minister that he retrieved a notebook from Miguel's house, containing all the financial records of the Cali Cartel and everyone receiving bribes from them. The only problem is that the notebook is encrypted, and the only people who can decode it are the cartel leaders, accountant Palomari, or Franklin, who is currently imprisoned in the United States. Javier explains to the minister that Franklin has not cooperated yet, but he will soon once they contact his wife, Cristina. The minister agrees to let Javier continue his mission, and Javier goes to meet Berna, who has become the top drug dealer in Medellin, the city that was once under Pablo Escobar's control. Berna tells Javier that he knows where Cristina is, she's with the insurgents in the jungle. He offers his help, along with Carlos and Fidel, on the condition that Javier informs them of any future American moves against them. Javier agrees, even though it's illegal, and they begin planning how to free Cristina. Meanwhile, Gilberto discovers that Franklin has been captured. Gilberto calls his brother Miguel and asks him to get rid of Franklin, as well as Palomari, because they can decode the notebook, which could lead to disaster. But Miguel dismisses Gilberto's concerns, forcing Gilberto to assign the task to his son, Nicholas. Javier and his men head to the jungle where Cristina is being held and finally manage to free her. At the same time, we see Franklin in his United States prison, where he is attacked by a fellow inmate associated with the Cali Cartel and killed in cold blood. News of Franklin's murder reaches Javier, who is shocked, realizing that all hope of decoding the notebook has vanished. Meanwhile, Nicholas receives a call from the hitman who carried out Franklin's assassination. We see that Nicholas, reluctantly, is getting deeper into his family's dirty business. We return to Miguel, who is sitting with his son David and some cartel members. During this meeting, Miguel and David are informed that there is a traitor within the cartel, and everyone suspects that the traitor is Enrique, as he was at the security post and didn't report the police presence. David contacts Jorge and asks him to come with Enrique, which makes Jorge realize that Enrique is in danger. Instead of putting Enrique at risk, Jorge takes him to a safe place to hide. Then, Jorge goes to meet Miguel and David and tells them he doesn't know where Enrique is. However, David begins to hint that Jorge himself might be the traitor. David then takes Jorge to Enrique's mother's house to check if he's there. Before Jorge gets out of the car, he leaves a recorder on, recording David's conversation with his friend. Afterward, we see that Miguel receives a set of recorded tapes, which contain conversations between his brother Gilberto and others. From these tapes, it becomes clear that Gilberto was trying to convince Pacho and Chepe to surrender. After listening to the recordings, Miguel decides to take action. Meanwhile, a refrigerator full of the bodies of Hanao's men, who had been watching Miguel in Cali, is delivered to Hanao. Hanao realizes that Miguel killed them and finds a note with the bodies that reads, "Contact me." Hanao decides to reach out to Miguel, but the details of their communication are not shown. Later, Miguel meets with Pacho and Chepe and tells them that he heard their conversations with Gilberto and knows they were considering surrender. Miguel offers them a better deal. Chepe can return to New York and continue working as he was, while Miguel tells Pacho that he has made a deal with Hanao to end their conflict in exchange for handing over Claudio's family for revenge. Miguel gives Pacho the location of Claudio's family, and Pacho is thrilled. Both Pacho and Chepe agree to rejoin Miguel and reject Gilberto's surrender plan. At the same time, Javier meets with Ambassador Arthur and informs him that someone within the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, or the Colombian government is leaking information to the Cali Cartel. Javier suspects that the Minister of Defense is the corrupt official. However, Ambassador Arthur refuses to believe this and tells Javier that he must arrest Miguel today, or he won't be able to continue the investigation. Javier seizes the opportunity and heads to Chris and Dan, asking them to prepare a task force to arrest Miguel. He then goes to General Serrano and asks him to personally lead the operation. Serrano, Chris, Dan, and Jorge develop a detailed plan to arrest Miguel. The plan involves Jorge luring Miguel out of the house so they can arrest him on the road. Everyone agrees on the plan. Meanwhile, Javier wants to confirm the corruption of the Minister of Defense, so he goes to him and tells him that Miguel will be at a specific location. At this moment, the minister becomes visibly nervous, and Javier realizes that the minister is indeed corrupt. On the other hand, Jorge goes to Miguel and tells him he needs to leave the house immediately because the police are coming. But shortly after, Miguel receives a call informing him that the police are already on their way. Miguel realizes that the Minister of Defense leaked the information. Jorge contacts Chris, who, along with his men, had surrounded the house, and tells him that Miguel is preparing to flee. At this point, we see that David, Miguel's son, has been tracking Jorge's movements and discovers that he has been frequenting the same location where he was meeting with Chris and Dan. David becomes convinced that Jorge is the traitor. David calls his father Miguel and informs him of his discovery. Miguel then begins torturing Jorge to force him to confess to his betrayal. At that moment, Chris realizes that Jorge has been inside the house too long and hasn't come out, so he decides to storm the house with his team. They kill all of Miguel's men, just as Miguel is about to kill Jorge. Miguel escapes with one of his men through a secret elevator, but they leave one of the cartel members to guard Jorge. Fortunately, Chris arrives at the last moment and saves Jorge by killing the guard. Meanwhile, Miguel flees in a car, But General Serrano chases him down and eventually captures him. On the other hand, David heads to exact revenge on Jorge's wife and children, but Dan has been watching over them to protect them. When David arrives at the house, he gets into a shootout with Dan and is forced to flee. Afterward, Dan takes Jorge's family to a safe location. In the end, Miguel is arrested and placed in prison. His brother Gilberto visits him in prison and tells him that he's not angry with him and that he will stay by his side until they both get out soon. Everyone wonders how Gilberto can be so confident that they'll be released quickly. The answer becomes clear when journalist Carolina meets with Javier and tells him that she has discovered that Medina, the person who negotiated with Gilberto, has close ties to Colombian President Ernesto and the Minister of Defense and is receiving money from them to protect the Cali Cartel. Carolina realizes that the President and the Minister of Defense will help the cartel leaders get out of prison without any consequences. Javier goes to Ambassador Arthur and informs him of what Carolina discovered. The ambassador surprises him by saying that the United States government already knows this but cannot act because President Ernesto is an ally of the United States. Javier becomes extremely frustrated by the rampant corruption. A few days later, Pacho fulfills his promise and goes to Claudio's family's house with his men, killing them all in cold blood. Afterward, Pacho decides to surrender, and Chepe follows suit. Both join Gilberto and Miguel in prison. At the same time, the Colombian president uses the situation to announce that he was the one who dismantled the Cali Cartel, even though that's not the truth. Javier realizes that his mission isn't over yet, so he goes to Jorge, who is now living in a secret apartment in Colombia while waiting to be relocated to the United States. Javier tells Jorge that the only way to ensure the cartel leaders remain in prison is to decode the notebook they retrieved from Miguel. But no one can decode it except for Palomari. Javier asks Jorge to help him find Palomari. Jorge informs Javier that Palomari's wife has a close associate named Freddy, and through him, they can find Palomari in the place where he's hiding. Jorge searches the house but doesn't find Enrique, so he informs David. David decides to stay and monitor the area, asking Jorge to go with Navagente on another mission. Once Jorge is in a safe place, he listens to the recording and discovers that David and his friend were talking about the presence of an informant within the Drug Enforcement Agency. David suspects that the informant might be Jorge. Jorge then goes with Navagente to Palomari's house to kill him, but they discover that Palomari has fled with his family. Palomari was clever enough to realize that the cartel would kill him once they discovered the notebook, so he escaped with his family. After this failed mission, Jorge receives a call from David, telling him they've found Enrique. Jorge rushes to the location, where he finds Enrique brutally tortured, with Miguel and David present. At this moment, David accuses Jorge of knowing about the presence of drug enforcement officers in the city and failing to report it to the cartel. They also claim that Enrique has confessed to being the traitor. They decide to kill Enrique, but before they do, a pager goes off in Enrique's pocket. It turns out to be a satellite pager given to informants by the American authorities. Jorge tells the cartel that this proves Enrique was the informant, thereby clearing himself of suspicion. Miguel and David quickly and brutally kill Enrique. In reality, it was Jorge who placed the pager in Enrique's pocket to save himself and his family. Despite feeling guilty, Jorge had no choice but to do it to protect himself. After the incident, Jorge contacts Dan and tells him that he knows where Miguel is and wants to help them arrest him. However, they must act quickly because Miguel has become increasingly unstable and dangerous and could kill anyone at any moment. After that, Javier wastes no time and goes directly to Freddy, telling him he needs his help to capture Palomari, promising him a large sum of money in return. Javier leaves after planning a listening device and learns that Freddy contacts Palomari's wife, asking her to turn in her husband to the United States authorities for the money. Palomari's wife doesn't make an immediate decision and prefers to think about it, but for Javier and Jorge, the wiretap was enough to determine Palomari's location. They decide to move in to arrest him. At the same time, Miguel calls his son David and orders him to kill Palomari. Miguel knows that if the United States authorities reach Palomari first and he agrees to cooperate with them by decoding the notebook, they will all be in danger. David reluctantly agrees and sends Navagente to assassinate Palomari once his location is known. Later, we see David at a casino he runs, where Maria, Miguel's wife, arrives to ask him for money and a place to live with her son. David has ignored them ever since Miguel was imprisoned. David refuses to help her and asks her to leave. In a moment of anger, Maria decides to get revenge on David, just as she betrayed Claudio before. She contacts Hanao and offers to reveal David's location in exchange for protection for herself and her son. Hanao agrees. On the same day, Freddy arrives at David's place, offering to hand over Palomari, hoping to get money from both sides. Instead, David tortures him to extract information about Palomari's whereabouts. Once David has the information, he sends Navagente to kill Palomari. Meanwhile, Javier, Chris, and Dan arrive at Palomari's house and begin negotiating with him, trying to convince him to surrender. They offer protection for his family and safe passage to the United States, in exchange for his help in decoding the notebook. After much thought, Palomari agrees to their terms. Outside, Jorge is securing the area, when Navagente suddenly appears and realizes that Jorge has betrayed the cartel. Despite his anger, Navagente decides not to kill Jorge immediately and plans to take him to David after finishing off Javier and Palomari. However, Jorge doesn't wait and pulls out his gun, killing Navagente on the spot. Afterward, Jorge, Javier, and the rest escape the area and head to the airport to transport Palomari to the United States. Meanwhile, David receives news of what happened and rushes to the airport, but before he can get there, he is ambushed by Henau's men and killed. Thus, David's story comes to a tragic end. In the following days, Palomari is tried in the United States and confesses everything, including the involvement of President Ernesto and the Minister of Defense in collaborating with the Cali Cartel. This confession causes a significant upheaval in Colombia, prompting President Ernesto to go on national television and deny the accusations. Meanwhile, the United States ambassador informs Javier that neither the president nor the Minister of Defense will face punishment, but at least Gilberto and the other cartel leaders will not be released from prison. However, this solution does not satisfy Javier, who decides to take matters into his own hands. He invites journalist Carolina for an interview, where he reveals all the facts, including the President and Minister of Defense's involvement with the cartel. He also mentions that the United States government is turning a blind eye to the situation because Ernesto is an ally. These statements cause a massive media uproar in Colombia, leading President Ernesto to announce that none of the cartel leaders will be released. Despite this, Chepe manages to use his connections to escape from prison. After his escape, he contacts Carlos and Fidel, asking them to collaborate with him to rebuild the Cali Cartel's empire. However, Carlos and Fidel feel betrayed by the cartel and decide to exact revenge by killing Chepe and dumping his body in the street. In prison, we see Pacho exacting revenge on a member of Henau's cartel by killing him in retaliation for the murder of Claudio and his family. Finally, Gilberto and Miguel are extradited to the United States, where they spend the rest of their lives in prison. As for Jorge, after the case is over, the United States government decides to prosecute him for his involvement with the Cali Cartel. He is forced to admit his guilt and is entered into the United States Witness Protection Program, where he disappears entirely. In Colombia, Jorge becomes a pariah, known as a rat, and if he ever considers returning to his country, he will be killed immediately. At last, after everything that has happened, Javier goes to meet Ambassador Arthur and tells him that he has decided to retire after successfully taking down the two largest drug trafficking organizations in the world, Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel and the Cali Cartel. In the final scene, we see Javier returning to his father's ranch, where he sits quietly with him, bringing this epic series, which is based on true events that happened in the real world, to a close. If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.